I'm Clarice Truman, 32, a successful marketing director who spent 5 years building my career from nothing after college. At our 10-year reunion, my ex-boyfriend Marcus stood before our former classmates and declared, "You are nothing without me. I made you." His words cut deep, especially since everyone knew our history. But what Marcus didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting every sabotaged opportunity. Every stolen idea, every lie he told about me during our relationship. As he basked in the applause for his achievements, I realized the time had come to reveal the truth. What happened next would expose not just his lies, but a web of manipulation that had shaped my entire adult life. The girl he claimed to have made was about to show him exactly who she'd become without him. Sometimes the best revenge is simply the truth served at exactly the right moment. Asterisk, looking back now, I can see the signs were there from the very beginning. But when you're 22 and in love for the first time, red flags just look like someone being passionate about you. Marcus and I met during our senior year at State University. I was studying marketing with a minor in communications, spending most of my time in the library or working on campaigns for the Student Advertising Club. He was charismatic, confident, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he talked to you. Our first conversation happened in the campus coffee shop. I was reviewing my final project of comprehensive marketing strategy for a local nonprofit when he approached my table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, already pulling out the chair. "I couldn't help but notice your work. Impressive stuff." I felt my cheeks flush. Marcus was known around campus. He was president of the business fraternity, always seemed to have connections, and had that effortless charm that made professors remember his name. That he was interested in my work felt incredible. "Thank you," I managed, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's for Professor Chun's strategic marketing class." "Chun's tough," he said, leaning closer to examine my charts and graphs. "But this is really sophisticated thinking. You've got natural talent." Looking back, I realized that was the first time he positioned himself as the expert, the one qualified to judge my abilities. But in that moment, his approval felt like validation. I'd been craving my entire academic career. We started dating 3 weeks later. Marcus had this way of making everything feel urgent and important. "We're perfect together, Clarice," he'd say. "We both understand business. We're both ambitious. We could build something amazing." He loved to talk about our future together. Late nights in his dorm room, he'd sketch out elaborate plans. "After graduation, we'll move to the city. I've got connections at several firms. We could both start our careers, maybe even work at the same company. Imagine what we could accomplish as a team." The graduation photo I still keep in my desk drawer captures that exact moment of possibility. We're standing together in our caps and gowns, his arm around my waist, both of us grinning at the camera. I remember feeling like the world was opening up before us, full of opportunities and adventures we'd share. "Promise me something," Marcus had said that day, after the ceremony. We were sitting on the steps of the administration building, watching other graduates celebrate with their families. "Promise me we'll always be honest with each other, that we'll support each other's dreams." "I promise," I'd said, meaning every word, "and promise me that no matter what happens, we'll remember that we're stronger together than apart. That what one of us achieves, we both achieve." It seemed romantic at the time. Now I understand it was the foundation for everything that came after, the way he'd claim credit for my ideas, the way he'd make me feel guilty for any success that didn't directly benefit him. But that day, surrounded by the promise of our future, I had no idea what I was really agreeing to. I just knew I loved him, and I believed he loved me. I thought we were going to build something beautiful together. I had no way of knowing that Marcus had very different ideas about what together actually meant. The first theft happened so smoothly that I almost missed it entirely. Marcus and I had both landed entry-level positions at Sterling and Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. He'd been right about his connections, his fraternity brothers. Father knew someone who knew someone, and suddenly we both had interviews. I'd gotten the job on my own merits, but Marcus made sure everyone knew he'd helped me get the opportunity. It's perfect, he said on our first day, straightening his tie in the reflection of the elevator doors. We can support each other, share ideas, really be a team. I should have paid more attention to how he said, share ideas. My first major assignment came 3 weeks into the job. Our supervisor, Janet Morrison, called me into her office on a Tuesday morning. Clarice, I'm giving you lead on the Riverside Community Center account. They need a complete rebranding campaign, new logo, messaging strategy, social media presence, the works. Think you're up for it? My heart pounded with excitement and terror in equal measure. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I dreamed about. Absolutely. When do you need the initial proposal? 2 weeks, and Clarice, this could really put you on the map here. Show us what you can do. I threw myself into the project with everything I had. Nights, weekends, early mornings, I researched community outreach strategies, analyzed demographic data, and studied successful rebranding campaigns for similar organizations. The idea that emerged was something I was genuinely proud of, building. Bridges, building community. The concept centered on the community center as a literal and metaphorical bridge connecting different neighborhoods, generations, and backgrounds. I created mock-ups for everything logos that incorporated bridge imagery with warm, welcoming colors, taglines that emphasize connection and growth, social media campaigns that would feature real community members sharing their stories. I even drafted a timeline for implementation and a budget breakdown that came in 15% under the requested amount. Marcus watched me work with what I thought was supportive interest. He'd bring me coffee during late nights at the office, ask thoughtful questions about my approach, and offer encouragement when I hit roadblocks. You're so creative, Clarice, he'd say, looking over my shoulder at the designs spread across my desk. I love how your mind works. You see possibilities where other people just see problems. The night before my presentation, I stayed late to make final adjustments to my proposal. Marcus offered to wait for me, but I insisted he go home. I just need another hour to perfect the budget projections, I told him. I'll see you tomorrow. When I finally packed up around 10 o'clock, I felt confident and prepared. The proposal was comprehensive, creative, and exactly what Riverside needed. I locked my drafts in my desk drawer and went home to get some sleep before the big presentation. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Marcus already in Janet's office, animated and gesturing as he spoke. Through the glass walls, I could see papers spread across her desk, papers that looked remarkably familiar. My stomach dropped. Clarice, Janet called out when she spotted me. Perfect timing. Marcus was just showing me some preliminary ideas for Riverside. You two make quite a team. I stepped into the office, my eyes immediately going to the documents on Janet's desk. They were my designs, my taglines, my budget projections, but with Marcus's name in the header. Marcus was telling me about your brainstorming sessions. Janet continued. I love this building bridges concept. Very sophisticated thinking. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to correct her, to explain that these were my ideas. Instead, he smiled modestly. Clarice helped refine some of the details, he said. We work really well together. Help refine the details of my own work. Actually, I started, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. These are the result of great collaboration, Marcus interrupted smoothly. I think what makes this campaign so strong is how we've combined our different perspectives. Janet nodded approvingly. This is exactly what I like to see from our junior staff. Teamwork, innovation, initiative. Marcus, I'd like you to present this to the client next week. My mouth went dry. Present what to the client? The Riverside campaign, Janet said, looking at me strangely. Weren't you listening? I felt like I was losing my mind. These were my ideas, my designs, my weeks of work, and somehow Marcus was going to present them as his own. But in front of Janet, with Marcus looking at me with what appeared to be genuine confusion, I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. Of course, I said weakly. The presentation. After Janet dismissed us, I pulled Marcus aside in the hallway. Marcus, what just happened in there? Those are my designs, my entire campaign concept. He looked hurt. Clarice, I thought we were working on this together. You said yourself that we were a team. I've been giving you feedback and suggestions for weeks. Feedback and suggestions aren't the same as, look, I know you put in a lot of work on this, and I appreciate that. But Janet specifically asked me to take the lead on presentations because of my experience with client relations. You'll still get credit. We're partners, remember? The way he said it made me feel petty and selfish for even bringing it up. After all, hadn't we agreed to support each other? And he was right that he had more experience with presentations, but as I watched him walk back to his desk with my original proposal documents in his hand, something cold settled in my stomach. The proposal I'd locked in my drawer the night before was gone, and Marcus had arrived at the office unusually early that morning, for the first time since we'd started dating. I found myself wondering if I really knew Marcus at all. The love letters started arriving about a month after the Riverside incident. Not emails or text, but actual handwritten letters slipped under my apartment door or left on my desk at work. At first, they felt romantic, thoughtful, the kind of gesture that made my friends sigh with envy. My dearest Clarice, the first one began. I know I'm not always good with words when we're together, but I need you to know how much you mean to me. Your creativity inspires me every day. Your passion for your work reminds me why I fell in love with you. Without you, I would be half the man I am today. I kept that letter in my jewelry box, taking it out to reread whenever we had a disagreement. It felt like proof that underneath his sometimes dismissive behavior, Marcus truly valued me. But as the letters continued, they began to feel different. More possessive, more controlling. I worry about you sometimes, Clarice. You're so trusting, so naive about how the business world really works. You need someone to protect you from people who might take advantage of your generous nature. I hope you know that I would never let anyone hurt you. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. But Marcus had a way of making his concerns sound reasonable, loving even. He'd point out how my college friends were using me when they asked for career advice. He'd suggest that my parents didn't really understand my ambitions and they expressed concern about how stressed I seemed. He questioned whether my coworkers had my best interests at heart when they invited me for drinks after work. I know Sarah thinks she's being a good friend. He said one evening after I'd mentioned grabbing lunch with my colleague, but you noticed how she only wants to spend time with you when she needs something? First, it was help with her presentation, then advice about her boyfriend troubles. Real friends don't keep scorecards like that. The thing about gaslighting is that it works slowly, like carbon monoxide poisoning. You don't realize what's happening until you're already too weak to fight back. Marcus would plant these little seeds of doubt, then water them with seemingly loving concern. I'm only telling you this because I care about you, became his constant refrain. I see things you don't see because I'm not as emotionally invested in these relationships as you are. Gradually, I began to question my own perceptions. When Sarah suggested that Marcus seemed to take credit for my ideas, I found myself defending him. He's just confident, I told her, and we are a team. We support each other. Sarah's expression was skeptical. Supporting each other is one thing, Clarice. But I was there when you came up with the building bridges concept. You spent weeks developing that campaign, and then suddenly Marcus is presenting it like it was his brainchild. You don't understand our relationship, I said, the words feeling rehearsed even as I spoke them. Marcus has more experience with client presentations. It makes sense for him to take the lead. Does it make sense for him to get all the credit? I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest. He's not getting all the credit. Janet knows I worked on it too, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Janet had been praising Marcus's innovative thinking for weeks. When the Riverside campaign won a regional marketing award, Marcus's name was the only one on the recognition letter. Letters kept coming, each one a little more intense than the last. I saw you talking to that new guy in accounting today. David, I think? Be careful, Clarice. Men in this business aren't always what they seem. They'll show interest in your work, your ideas, but what they're really interested in is taking advantage of you. I've seen it happen to other women in our industry. You're too pure, too trusting to see it coming. When I confronted Marcus about the letter, he looked genuinely wounded. I'm concerned about you, Clarice. Is that a crime? I see how men look at you, how they try to get close to you. Do you think they care about you as a person, or are they just trying to use you? David was asking about my marketing background because he's thinking about switching departments, I said. It was a professional conversation. Was it? Because from where I was sitting, it looked like he was flirting with you, and you were eating it up. The accusation stung because part of me had enjoyed David's attention. He'd seemed genuinely interested in my ideas, asked thoughtful questions about my approach to campaign development. It had felt good to talk to. Someone who didn't interrupt or redirect the conversation back to himself. I wasn't flirting, I said. My voice lacked conviction. Marcus softened, reaching for my hands. I know you weren't trying to. That's what makes you so special, Clarice. You're too good to see what other people's real motives are. But I can see it, and it scares me. I couldn't stand to watch someone take advantage of you. These conversations always ended the same way, with me apologizing for making Marcus worry, promising to be more careful, more aware of other people's real intentions. Each time I felt a little smaller, a little more dependent on his perspective to navigate the world. My family noticed the change during Sunday dinners at my parents' house. You seem different lately, sweetheart, my mother said one evening as we cleared the dishes. Quieter. Are you feeling all right? I'm fine, Mom. Just focused on work. And Marcus? How are things going with him? I hesitated. Good, he's very supportive of my career. My mother's expression was carefully neutral. That's nice, dear. Though I have to say, the last few times you've been here, you've seemed a bit on edge, like you're worried about something. I'm not worried about anything. But that was a lie. I was worried constantly about whether I was being too friendly with male colleagues, about whether my ideas were really my own or just variations on things Marcus had suggested, about whether I was reading too much into innocent interactions or not reading enough into dangerous ones. The letters had become my compass, Marcus's concerns my map for navigating relationships and professional situations. Without them, I felt lost, uncertain about my own judgment. Remember, his latest letter concluded, you're stronger with me than you could ever be alone. Together, we can achieve anything. Apart, you're vulnerable to all the people who would exploit your trusting nature. I love you too much to let that happen. I folded that letter carefully and placed it with the others, never noticing how they'd slowly transformed from expressions of love into instruments of control. The hospital bracelet still sits in my memory box, a thin white band with my name and a date I'll never forget, March 15th. 2 years into my relationship with Marcus. It started with headaches. Not unusual ones, I'd always been prone to tension, headaches during stressful periods at work. But these were different. They came with a crushing weight in my chest, a feeling like I couldn't get enough air no matter how deeply I breathed. You're working too hard, Marcus said when I mentioned feeling lightheaded during meetings. You need to learn to pace yourself better. You're not as strong as you think you are. The attacks, because that's what they were, though I didn't recognize them at first, started happening at work. I'd be in the middle of a presentation or client call, and suddenly the room would start spinning. My heart would race, my palms would sweat, and I'd feel this overwhelming sense of impending doom. Maybe you should consider whether this job is really right for you, Marcus suggested after I had to excuse myself from a meeting for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Some people just aren't cut out for high-pressure environments. There's no shame in admitting that. His words felt like a diagnosis rather than support. I began to wonder if he was right, if I was simply too fragile for the career I'd worked so hard to build. The night I ended up in the emergency room, Marcus and I had been at his apartment, planning what he called our 5-year strategy. He'd spread papers across his coffee table, charts and graphs detailing career trajectories, salary projections, and partnership possibilities. The way I see it, he said, pointing to a timeline he'd created. You should focus on supporting roles for the next few years while I establish myself in leadership positions. Once I'm senior management, I can bring you up with me. We'll be unstoppable. I stared at the chart, trying to process what I was seeing. According to Marcus's plan, I would spend the next 5 years as assistant, essentially. My own ambitions, my own talents were reduced to supporting his rise through the company hierarchy. What about my own career goals? I asked quietly. Marcus looked up from his papers, his expression patient but condescending. Clarice, we've talked about this. You're incredibly talented, but you're not leadership material. You're too emotional, too trusting. People would walk all over you in a management position. That's not true, isn't it? Look at what happened with the Davidson account last month. You let the client push you around, agreed to changes that ate into our profit margin because you couldn't stand the thought of disappointing them. A real leader would have held firm. The Davidson situation had been complicated. The client was a small nonprofit with a limited budget, and I genuinely believed that flexibility on our part would lead to long-term loyalty. But Marcus had reframed it as weakness, as evidence that I couldn't make tough business decisions. I was building a relationship, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. You were being taken advantage of. Again. Marcus set down his pen and looked at me seriously. Clarice, I love you, but you have to face reality. Not everyone is meant to. Be a leader. There's no shame in being an excellent support person. Look at all the successful partnerships where one person is the visionary and the other is the implementer. As he spoke, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest beginning to build. But I am a visionary. The Building Bridges campaign, the Morrison Electronics rebranding, the social media strategy for Patterson Industries, those were all my ideas. Marcus's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity. Sweetheart, we developed those campaigns together. I guided you through the conceptual framework. You handled the execution details. That's exactly the kind of partnership I'm talking about. The room started to spin. Those campaigns had been my research, my insights, my creative vision. But Marcus had a way of inserting himself into the narrative so smoothly that I began to doubt my own memories. I can't breathe, I whispered. What? I can't breathe. The words came out in a rush as my chest constricted. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. The walls of Marcus's apartment seemed to be closing in, and I felt like I was drowning in open air. Clarice, calm down. You're being dramatic, but I couldn't calm down. The anxiety attack hit with the force of a freight train. I stumbled to the bathroom and vomited from the sheer panic coursing through my system. When I came back to the living room, Marcus was still sitting at his coffee table, looking annoyed rather than concerned. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said. You can't handle stress. How do you expect to lead people when you fall apart at the first sign of pressure? His words made everything worse. I felt like I was suffocating, like the very air in the room had turned toxic. I need to go to the hospital, I managed to gasp. You need to sit down and breathe. This is all in your head. But it wasn't in my head. The crushing pain in my chest, the way my vision kept tunneling, the feeling that I was about to die, these were real physical symptoms of a mind and body pushed beyond their limits. I called an Uber to the emergency room, leaving Marcus behind with his charts and his 5-year plan. In the bright fluorescent lights of the hospital, a kind doctor named Elena Rodriguez asked me gentle questions while monitoring my heart rate and blood pressure. Have you been under unusual stress lately? She asked, reviewing my test results. I don't know, I said honestly. I mean, work is always stressful, but I feel like I can't trust my own judgment anymore. Like, I don't know what's real and what's not. Dr. Rodriguez looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months, genuine concern without judgment. Tell me about your support system. Do you have people in your life who make you feel safe and valued? I opened my mouth to mention Marcus, then stopped. When was the last time I'd felt safe with him? When was the last time he made me feel valued rather than criticized? I used to, I said finally. What changed? That was the question that broke something open inside me. What had changed? When had I started second-guessing every thought, every feeling, every instinct? When had I begun to see myself through Marcus's eyes instead of my own? Dr. Rodriguez gave me information about anxiety treatment and stress management. But more importantly, she gave me something I hadn't received in months. Validation that my Feelings were real, that my distress was legitimate, that I deserved to be heard and believed. The hospital bracelet they gave me was thin and unremarkable, but I kept it anyway. It was proof of a moment when someone had taken my pain seriously, when I'd been treated as a person worthy of care rather than someone whose emotions were inconvenient obstacles to be managed. Marcus finally showed up as I was being discharged, full of apologies and concern that felt performative rather than genuine. "I was so worried about you," he said, taking my arm as we walked to his car. "You scared me back there." "But this just proves what I've been saying. You need to take better care of yourself. Maybe we should look into some stress management techniques, or even consider whether this job is really worth your health." Even then, even after everything, he was using my breakdown as evidence to support his narrative about my inadequacy. But for the first time in months, I had something to compare his words against the gentle professionalism of Dr. Rodriguez, who had treated my distress as valid rather than something to be dismissed or managed. It would take me several more months to fully understand what had happened that night. But the hospital bracelet became a reminder of the moment I started to remember that my feelings mattered, that I deserved to be heard, and that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't my weakness. Maybe the problem was that I'd been slowly poisoned by someone who claimed to love me. The therapy journal was Dr. Martinez's idea. "I want you to write down your thoughts and feelings," she said during our first session 3 weeks after my emergency room visit. "Not for anyone else to read, but for you to process. Sometimes we don't realize what we're thinking until we see it written down." Dr. Martinez was nothing like I'd expected a therapist to be. She was warm but direct, with silver hair and laugh lines that suggested she'd heard every story and judged none of them. When I first called her office, I'd been terrified that she would think I was wasting her time, that my problems weren't serious enough for professional help. "I don't even know if I need therapy," I admitted during that first appointment. "Maybe I'm just not handling stress well. Tell me about the stress in your life." It should have been a simple question, but I found myself stumbling over the answer. How could I explain that I felt like I was disappearing, that every day I became a little less myself? How could I describe the constant anxiety that I was doing everything wrong, thinking everything wrong, being everything wrong? "My boyfriend says I'm too sensitive," I finally said, "that I take things too personally. Maybe if I could just be stronger, ... double quotes." Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. "What do you think? Do you feel like you're too sensitive?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked what I thought in months. I don't know anymore. I used to think I was pretty resilient, but Marcus, my boyfriend, he points out things I don't see. Ways I'm being naive or emotional when I should be logical. "Can you give me an example?" I told her about the Davidson account, about how Marcus had reframed my flexibility as weakness. As I spoke, Dr. Martinez took notes, but her expression remained neutral, interested. "How did you feel about your decision with the Davidson client before Marcus gave you his perspective?" "I felt good about it," I said, surprised by my own answer. I thought I was building a long-term relationship, showing that we cared about their mission as much as their budget. And after Marcus shared his thoughts, I felt stupid. Like I'd been taken advantage of. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Clarice, I'd like you to consider something. You made a business decision based on your professional judgment and your values. Someone else disagreed with that decision. Does their disagreement necessarily mean you were wrong?" The question was revolutionary. For months, I'd been operating under the assumption that Marcus's perspective was more valid than mine, that his experience and confidence made him a better judge of situations than I was. The possibility that we could both be right, or that I could be right and he could be wrong, hadn't occurred to me. That's when she suggested the journal. The first entries were hesitant, self-conscious. I wrote about work stress, about feeling overwhelmed, about my relationship with Marcus in careful diplomatic terms. But as weeks passed, the writing became more honest. March 30th, Marcus said something today that's been bothering me. We were discussing the Peterson campaign, and I mentioned an idea about targeting younger demographics through social media partnerships. He immediately said it wouldn't work because young people don't have real purchasing power. But when I looked up the demographic data later, it turns out the 25 to 34 age group has significant disposable income for the Peterson market. Why didn't he want to consider the research? April 5th, had lunch with Sarah today. She mentioned that she heard Marcus taking credit for the Morrison rebranding in a meeting with senior management. She said he presented it as entirely his concept, never mentioned my involvement. When I asked him about it later, he said he was representing our team and that I shouldn't be so concerned with individual recognition, but I am concerned with recognition. Is that wrong? April 12th, Marcus went through my phone today while I was in the shower. He said he was just checking the time, but I saw him scrolling through my text messages. Later, he made comments about my conversation with David from accounting, asking why I was so friendly with male colleagues. I don't understand why wanting to be professional and personable is a problem. As I wrote, patterns began to emerge that I hadn't noticed in real time. Marcus's tendency to dismiss my ideas, then present variations of them as his own. His need to know where I was, who I was talking to, what I was thinking. His way of reframing my strengths as weaknesses, my empathy as naivety, my collaboration as people-pleasing, my ambition as unrealistic. Dr. Martinez helped me identify these patterns during our sessions. What do you notice when you read back? Through your entries? She asked. I noticed that I question myself a lot. Anything else? I flipped through pages of careful handwriting, months of documented doubts and second-guessing. I noticed that Marcus always seems to have opinions about what I should and shouldn't do, think, or feel. How does that sit with you? It sat like a stone in my stomach. I thought he was trying to help me. Help you do what? Be better. Be stronger. Be more successful. Do you feel better, stronger, or more successful than you did a year ago? The answer was immediate and devastating. No, I felt smaller, more confused, less confident in my abilities and judgment than I had since college. That's when Dr. Martinez introduced me to terms I'd never heard before: emotional abuse, gaslighting, manipulation. She gave me books to read, articles that described relationship patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar. But he loves me, I protested during one session. He tells me all the time, and he does want what's best for me. People can love us and still treat us badly, Dr. Martinez said gently. And sometimes what someone thinks is best for us is actually what's most convenient for them. The journal entries became more specific, more analytical. May 20th, Marcus suggested I shouldn't go to Sarah's birthday party because it's on a weeknight and I need to focus on my career. But I've been working late every night this week, and I miss my friends. When I said I wanted to go for just an hour, he got quiet and said he was disappointed that I would prioritize socializing over our relationship. Why does having friends feel like a betrayal? May 25th, realized today that I haven't made a major decision without Marcus's input in months. Not just relationship decisions, work decisions, financial decisions, even what to order at restaurants. When did I become so dependent on his approval? I used to be decisive. I used to trust my own judgment. June 2nd, Marcus came to my office today during lunch to surprise me, but I think he was really checking to see who I was eating with. When he saw me with David and 2 other colleagues, he stayed and dominated the conversation, making subtle jokes about my academic approach to marketing that made me feel foolish in front of my coworkers. Later, he said he was just being friendly, but it felt like he was marking his territory. The breakthrough came during a session in late June. Dr. Martinez asked me to read an entry aloud where I documented Marcus's reaction to my interest in applying for a senior marketing position that had opened up at our company. He said I wasn't ready for that level of responsibility, I read from my journal. That I should wait until I had more experience, more confidence. He said if I applied now and didn't get it, it would damage my reputation and make me look desperate. What do you think about his advice? I paused, feeling the familiar anxiety that came with disagreeing with Marcus, even in his absence. I think I'm ready. I have 3 years of experience. I've successfully managed major campaigns, and I have strong relationships with clients. I think he doesn't want me to advance because it threatens his sense of control. Saying it out loud was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For the first time in months, I was trusting my own judgment over his. "Clarice," Dr. Martinez said, "what would happen if you applied for that position anyway?" The question opened up possibilities I had forgotten existed. What would happen if I made decisions based on my own assessment of my abilities rather than Marcus's? What would happen if I prioritized my own career growth over his comfort level? What would happen if I started living my own life again? The journal became my anchor during those weeks of slowly awakening awareness. Every doubt, every manipulation, every moment of clarity, all documented in my own handwriting. Undeniable proof that my perceptions were valid and my feelings were. Real doubt it would take several more months to act on what I was learning. But the foundation was being laid one journal entry at a time for the person I was going to become when I finally found the courage to trust myself again. The engagement ring sits in my jewelry box now, a symbol of everything I almost lost to Marcus's vision of our future. It was a beautiful ring. Classic solitaire with a platinum band that caught the light from every angle. Marcus had excellent taste, I'll give him that. He also had excellent timing, proposing just as I was beginning to establish boundaries and question his control over my life. The proposal happened on a Saturday evening in October, 6 months after I'd started therapy. We were at Riverfront Park, the same place where we'd had our first official date 3 years earlier. Marcus had planned everything meticulously, a picnic dinner, candles despite the cool evening air, even a photographer hidden in the distance to capture the moment. "Clarice," he said, taking my hands as we sat on the blanket he'd spread beside the river. "These past 3 years have been the best of my life. You've made me a better person, and I hope I've done the same for you." I smiled, though something, and his phrasing fell off. The past few months of therapy had made me more attuned to the subtle ways. Marcus centered himself in narratives about our relationship. "I know things have been challenging lately," he continued. "I know you've been stressed about work, about us, about your direction in life. But I want you to know that I'm committed to helping you through all of that. I want to take care of you, to protect you, to make sure you never have to face life's difficulties alone." The words should have been romantic, but they felt like a job description for a caretaker rather than a declaration of partnership. Still, when he dropped to one knee and opened the ring box, my heart raced with a mixture of excitement and something that might have been dread. "Clarice Mary Truman, will you marry me?" I said yes. How could I not? He was offering me everything I thought I wanted: commitment, security, a future together. The ring was gorgeous, his speech was heartfelt, and the moment was picture perfect. Literally, the photographer captured my surprise, my tears, Marcus sliding the ring onto my finger with such tender care. But even as I said yes, even as I kissed him and let him spin me around in celebration, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that something wasn't right. This didn't feel like the beginning of something beautiful. It felt like the closing of a trap. The engagement period was when Marcus's true nature fully revealed itself. With the ring on my finger and my commitment secured, his need for control intensified. Suddenly, every aspect of our wedding became a negotiation where my preferences were consistently overruled. "I think we should have this ceremony at the country club," he announced one evening as we sat with wedding magazines spread across his coffee table. "My family has connections there, and it's the kind of venue that will make the right impression on our professional contacts." "I was hoping for something smaller," I said. "Maybe the botanical gardens? Something more intimate and personal." Marcus's expression shifted to that patient condescension I'd come to dread. "Clarice, this wedding isn't just about us. It's about establishing our place in the community, building the network we'll need for our careers. The botanical gardens are pretty, but they don't send the right message about our ambitions." Every detail became a battle. The guest list grew from my vision of 50 close friends and family members to Marcus's requirement for 200 business, associates, and distant relatives. My preference for simple, elegant flowers was replaced with elaborate arrangements that matched the country club's aesthetic standards. Even my wedding dress became a source of conflict when Marcus insisted. on accompanying me to appointments and expressing opinions about necklines and silhouettes. "I want to make sure you look perfect," he said when I questioned his involvement. "This is the most important day of our lives. I need to know you'll be comfortable and confident." But his definition of perfect seemed to involve transforming me into someone I didn't recognize. The dress he preferred was beautiful, but felt like a costume too formal, too restrictive, too much like someone else's vision of a bride. The breaking point came during a discussion about our honeymoon plans. I suggested a week in Tuscany, a trip we talked about taking together since college, but Marcus had other ideas. "Actually, I've been thinking we should go to the Bahamas instead," he said, showing me a brochure for an all-inclusive resort. "It's more relaxing, less cultural stuff to navigate." You know how you get overwhelmed when you have to deal with language barriers and unfamiliar customs. I stared at the brochure, feeling something inside me rebel. "Marcus, I speak decent Italian, and I've been dreaming about that trip for years. When did I ever say I get overwhelmed by travel?" "You don't have to say it. I can see it. Remember when we went to Montreal for that conference? You were anxious the whole time about ordering food and asking for directions. That wasn't how I remembered Montreal at all. I'd been excited about practicing my French, curious about the city's architecture and culture. If I'd seemed anxious, it was because Marcus had criticized my pronunciation and made jokes about my academic approach to travel that made me self-conscious about expressing enthusiasm. "I wanted to go to Italy," I said firmly. Marcus's expression darkened. "Fine. If you want to spend our honeymoon dealing with crowds and tourist traps and mediocre food, we'll go to Italy. I just thought you'd want something more romantic, more focused on us. But apparently, sightseeing is more important to you than celebrating our marriage." The guilt trip was expertly applied, but for once, it didn't work. Months of therapy had given me tools to recognize manipulation, even when it was dressed up as concern for my happiness. "It's not about sightseeing versus celebrating," I said. "It's about you dismissing what I want without even considering it." "I'm not dismissing anything. I'm trying to plan a honeymoon that will be enjoyable for both of us. By unilaterally deciding that what I enjoy is wrong?" The argument escalated from there, with Marcus employing every technique in his emotional manipulation toolkit. I was being unreasonable. I was prioritizing trivial details over our relationship. I was so focused on being right that I couldn't see how my stubbornness was hurting us both. But this time, instead of backing down and apologizing, I held my ground. "We're going to Italy, Marcus. That's what I want. And my wants matter too." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in our relationship. Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Surprise, yes, but also something that looked almost like respect. For a moment, I thought we'd turned a corner, that he was seeing me as an equal partner for the first time. I was wrong. 3 days later, I discovered the affair. I'd stopped by his apartment unexpectedly to drop off cake tasting samples from the bakery. Marcus had been insisting we needed to make a decision about the wedding cake, and since the bakery was near my office, I'd offered to pick up the samples during my lunch break. I used my key to let myself in, calling his name as I entered. When he didn't answer, I assumed he wasn't home and headed to the kitchen to put the cake samples in the refrigerator. That's when I heard the voices from his bedroom. Marcus's voice, low and intimate, and another voice I recognized with a sick twist in my stomach. Jennifer Walsh, his coworker from the marketing department. The same Jennifer he'd assured me was just a friend when I'd mentioned noticing their frequent coffee meetings. I should have left immediately. Instead, I stood frozen in his kitchen, listening to the sounds of their intimacy through the thin walls. When I finally moved, it was to place the cake samples carefully in the refrigerator and let myself out as quietly as I'd entered. The drive back to my office passed in a blur. I sat in my car in the parking garage, staring at the engagement ring on my finger, trying to process what I'd just discovered. Part of me felt devastated, betrayed, heartbroken. But underneath those expected emotions was something I hadn't anticipated. Relief. The affair wasn't just Marcus being unfaithful. It was proof that everything I'd been questioning about our relationship was valid. A man who truly loved and respected me wouldn't cheat on me. A man who saw me as an equal partner wouldn't betray our trust so casually. When Marcus called that evening, his voice was perfectly normal. How did the cake tasting go? Did you pick up the samples? I picked them up, I said carefully. They're in your refrigerator. Great. I'll try them when I get home. Hey, I'm sorry about our argument the other day. You're right, Italy will be perfect for our honeymoon. I was just being overprotective. The apology that I would have welcomed a week earlier now felt hollow, manipulative. He wasn't apologizing because he understood that he'd been controlling. He was apologizing because he'd sensed my pulling away and wanted to reel me back in. We need to talk, I said. About the wedding? Clarice, I already said you were right about Italy. Not about the wedding. About us. There was a pause. What about us? I know about Jennifer. The silence stretched for so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. What? Do you think you know? I know you're sleeping with her. I know you've been lying to me about your relationship with her. I know that while you've been planning our wedding and talking about our future, you've been betraying everything we're supposed to mean to each other. What happened next was perhaps the most terrifying moment of our entire relationship. Instead of denial, guilt, or even anger, Marcus became coldly calculating. If you think you can prove anything, you're mistaken, he said. Jennifer and I work together. We have a professional relationship. If you want to turn that into some kind of sort of fantasy because you're feeling insecure about our engagement, that's your choice. But don't expect me to play along with your paranoia. The gaslighting was so immediate, so practiced, that I knew this wasn't his first time being caught in a lie. This was a man who had perfected the art of making his victims question their own reality. I heard you, Marcus. I was in your apartment. I heard both of you. You heard what you wanted to hear. You've been looking for reasons to sabotage our relationship ever since you started that therapy nonsense. Your therapist has filled your head with ideas about me being controlling or manipulative, and now you're creating drama to prove her right. Even Dr. Martinez had warned me about this, how abusers often escalate their tactics when they sense their victims pulling away. But experiencing it was different from being prepared for it. The sheer audacity of Marcus trying to convince me that I'd imagined what I clearly heard was breathtaking in its cruelty. I'm returning the ring, I said quietly. Clarice, don't be ridiculous. You're upset. You're not thinking clearly. Why don't you come over tomorrow and we'll talk about this like adults? No. The word came out stronger than I felt, but it felt good to say it. Dr. Martinez had been working with me on setting boundaries, on learning to say no without justifying or explaining myself to death. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, I won't come over. No, I won't pretend I didn't see what I saw. No, I won't marry someone who cheats on me and then tries to convince me I'm crazy for objecting to it. Marcus's voice turned dangerous. You're making a mistake, Clarice. You think you can make it on your own? You think anyone else is going to put up with your insecurities and your need for constant validation? I've spent 3 years building you up, helping you become someone worth respecting. And this is how you repay me? There it was, the threat that had been underlying our entire relationship. That without him, I was nothing. That my success, my worth, my very identity existed only because he had created and maintained it. 6 months earlier, those words would have destroyed me. They would have sent me crawling back, apologizing for my paranoia and begging him to help me be better. But 6 months of therapy had given me something Marcus couldn't take away. The knowledge that his version of me wasn't the real me. You're right, I said, surprising him into silence. I'm making a mistake. I made it 3 years ago when I let you convince me that I needed you to be whole. Clarice, I'm done, Marcus. I'm returning the ring, canceling the wedding, and ending this relationship. Don't contact me again. I hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely remove the engagement ring, but I managed it, setting it carefully in its original box. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls canceling vendors, explaining to family members that the wedding was off, fielding concerned questions I wasn't ready to answer. But with each conversation, I felt lighter, like I was shedding a skin that had never really fit. Marcus tried everything over the next few days. Flowers with apology notes, text, messages that alternated between pleading and threatening. He even showed up at my office, causing such a scene that security had to escort him out. But the most telling moment came when he tried to weaponize our professional relationship. 3 days after I'd ended our engagement, I arrived at work too. Find that the Morrison account, one of my most successful campaigns, had been reassigned to Marcus. When I asked Janet Morrison about it, she looked uncomfortable. Marcus felt that given your personal situation, it might be better if he took the lead on client relations for a while. He's concerned that your emotional state might affect your professional judgment. The manipulation was breathtaking in its efficiency. In one move, Marcus had positioned himself as a responsible professional, while painting me as an unstable woman whose personal problems made her unreliable. It was exactly the kind of calculated cruelty I should have expected from someone who could cheat on his fiancée and then try to convince her she'd imagined it. But this time, instead of being devastated by his betrayal, I was energized by it. This was proof of everything Dr. Martinez had been helping me understand about emotional abuse, how it escalates when the victim tries to leave, how abusers will use any weapon at their disposal to maintain control. I documented everything, every inappropriate contact attempt, every professional retaliation, every lie he told about our relationship to mutual colleagues. I was building a case, though I didn't yet know what I planned to do with it. The engagement ring went back to the jewelry store where Marcus had bought it. The sales associate who processed the return looked at me with the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested she'd seen this before. "I'm sorry it didn't work out," she said gently as she processed. "The paperwork." "I'm not," I replied, and meant it. For the first time in 3 years, I was free to be myself, flaws, strengths, ambitions, and all. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Marcus had been right about one thing. I was making a mistake. But it wasn't the mistake of leaving him, Dot. It was the mistake of staying with him for so long. The keys to my new apartment were small and unremarkable, but they represented the most important decision I'd made in years, choosing myself over the comfortable prison Marcus had built around me. Dot. Finding the apartment had been an adventure and rediscovering my own preferences. For 3 years, every living decision had been filtered through Marcus's opinions. He preferred modern furniture, so he'd furnished his place with sleek lines and neutral colors that felt cold to me. He thought artwork was a waste of money, so his walls were bare except for a few photographs of us together. He believed in maximizing space efficiency, which meant everything had to serve a practical purpose, no room for the books I loved, the plants that made me happy, or the vintage pieces I'd collected in college. Now, standing in my own space. For the first time, I felt like I was meeting myself again. It was a small one-bedroom in an older building across town, far enough from Marcus's neighborhood to feel safe, close enough to work to make my commute manageable. The hardwood floors creaked slightly when I walked across them, and the bathroom fixtures were definitely from the 1980s. But it had character in a way that Marcus's sterile apartment never had. Most importantly, it had a huge window in the living room that faced east, filling the space with morning light. I'd fallen in love with that window during my first viewing, imagining how beautiful it would look with plants arranged along the sill and sheer curtains that would let the sunshine pour in. "It's perfect," I'd told the landlord, surprising myself with how quickly I'd made the decision. For years, I had gotten used to consulting Marcus about everything, but this choice was entirely mine. Moving out of Marcus's apartment had been complicated. Technically, I'd never lived there officially. I kept my old studio apartment even after spending most nights at his place, something he complained about regularly. "It's a waste of money," he'd said more than once. "You're here every night anyway. Why are you throwing away rent on a place you never use?" At the time, I thought my reluctance to give up my lease was about financial security. Now I realized it had been self-preservation, some unconscious part of me maintaining an escape route even when I couldn't admit I might need one. Still, over 3 years, I'd accumulated a significant amount of belongings at Marcus's place. Clothes, books, kitchen gadgets I brought to make cooking there more enjoyable. artwork and photographs that had gradually made their way to his walls. The process of reclaiming these items felt like archaeological work excavating evidence of the person I'd been before. Marcus convinced me she wasn't good enough. I planned to retrieve my things when Marcus was at work, but he'd anticipated this and taken time off to be there. The confrontation was awkward and painful, with him alternating between desperate pleas for a reconciliation and cold anger about my selfishness. "You're really going to throw away 3 years together because of some misunderstanding?" he asked as I packed my books into boxes. "Clarice, I love you. We can work through this." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Marcus. I know what I heard." "Fine. Yes, Jennifer and I have been close, but it didn't mean anything. She was going through a divorce. She needed someone to talk to. Things got complicated for a while, but it's over now. She means nothing to me." The casual way he dismissed Jennifer, a woman I actually liked during the few times we'd met socially, was almost more disturbing than the affair itself. This wasn't remorse. It was damage control. "It's not just about Jennifer," I said, continuing to pack. "It's about everything. The way you dismiss my ideas at work, the way you make me question my own judgment, the way you've made me feel like I need your permission to exist." Marcus's expression shifted to the patronizing patience I'd come to dread. "I've been trying to help you, Clarice. You're talented, but you're naive about how the business world works. I've been protecting you, guiding you, helping you avoid mistakes that could damage your career. By taking credit for my work, by ensuring it gets the recognition it deserves. Do you think Janet Morrison would have taken the Building Bridges campaign seriously if it had come from a junior marketing associate? I have the credibility to sell your ideas at the executive level." Even then, even knowing what I knew about manipulation and gaslighting, his words had the power to make me doubt myself. Was he right? Had his involvement actually helped my career? Was I being ungrateful for the support he provided? But then I remembered Dr. Martinez's voice. "Trust your instincts, Clarice. Your feelings are valid data about your experiences." My instinct was telling me that Marcus's help had consistently made me smaller, less confident, more dependent on his approval. Whatever short-term career benefits his involvement might have provided, the cost to my self-esteem and professional independence had been enormous. "I'm not discussing this anymore," I said, sealing another box. "I've made my decision." Marcus watched me pack for another hour, occasionally offering commentary about items I was taking. "You bought that cookbook with my credit card," he pointed out when I packed my collection of Italian cookbooks. "And those throw pillows, we picked those out together for our future home." Every item became a negotiation, a chance for him to assert continued ownership over pieces of my life. By the time Sarah arrived with her SUV to help me move, I was exhausted from the psychological warfare disguised as logistics. "You okay?" Sarah asked quietly as we loaded boxes into her car. She'd been my closest friend before Marcus, and one of the first people I called after ending the engagement. "I'm better than I've been in years," I said, and was surprised to realize it was true. Setting up my new apartment became an act of self-discovery. Without Marcus's opinions to consider, I found myself making choices I'd forgotten I was capable of. I painted the bedroom a soft sage green that reminded me of spring mornings. I arranged my books by subject rather than size, creating a small library that reflected my actual interests rather than what looked impressive on shelves. The kitchen became my sanctuary. I hung my grandmother's vintage mixing bowls from hooks under the cabinets and displayed my collection of wooden spoons in a ceramic crock I'd bought at a farmer's market. For the first time in years, I cooked meals because I wanted to, not because I was trying to impress someone or fulfill an expectation. The most symbolic purchase was a small writing desk I found at an antique store downtown. It was nothing fancy, walnut. Wood with brass handles. Probably from the 1940s, but it spoke to me in a way that Marcus's sleek modern furniture never had. I placed it by the big window and created a space where I could continue my therapy journaling and maybe someday try my hand at the creative writing I loved in college. Marcus tried to contact me constantly during those first weeks. Phone, calls, text messages, emails that ranged from apologetic to accusatory to threatening. He sent flowers to my office with notes that said things like, I'm sorry for everything. Please give us another chance. When I didn't respond, the messages became darker. You're making a huge mistake, one text read. You think you can just walk away from everything we built together? You'll be back when you realize how hard it is to make it on your own. I showed these messages to Dr. Martinez during our sessions. How do they make you feel? She asked. Scared, I admitted, but also angry. He's still trying to control me even though we're not together anymore. What would you like to do about that? I want to change my phone number. I want to block him on all social media. I want to make it clear that his opinion of my choices no longer matters to me. Those all sound like healthy boundary setting strategies. Taking those steps felt like claiming my independence in a concrete way. The first night I slept in my new apartment with my new phone number, no longer accessible to Marcus's manipulation and criticism. I slept better than I had. In months, the financial reality of living alone was challenging at first. I'd grown accustomed to splitting expenses with Marcus, and supporting myself entirely on my marketing associate's salary meant budgeting carefully. But there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that every dollar I spent was my own choice. Every purchase was made according to my own priorities. I discovered that I actually enjoyed living simply. Without Marcus's pressure to maintain appearances or impress his colleagues, I could focus on what actually made me happy. Fresh flowers from the grocery store instead of expensive arrangements. Books from the library instead of costly hardcovers. I felt obligated to display. Meals cooked at home instead of frequent dinners at restaurants. Marcus chose to network with potential clients. 3 weeks after moving in, I had my first dinner party. Just Sarah and 2 other friends from college, nothing elaborate homemade pasta. A simple salad, wine from a bottle that cost less than Marcus typically spent on appetizers. But as we sat around my small dining table, laughing and talking about books and travel and dreams for the future, I felt more like myself than I had in years. You seem different, Sarah observed as we did dishes afterward. Lighter somehow. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 3 years and finally remembered how to exhale. That night, after my friends left, I sat at my new writing desk and looked out at the city lights beyond my window. For the first time since college, I felt like my life belonged to me, messy and uncertain and entirely my own. The keys to my apartment sat on the desk beside my journal. 2 small pieces of metal that represented the most valuable thing I'd ever owned. My freedom to choose who I wanted to become. The first paycheck from Meridian Creative Group felt like a resurrection. It wasn't just the money, though. The 20% salary increase was certainly welcome. It was what that paycheck represented. Proof that I had value in the marketplace. That my skills and experience were worth something independent of Marcus's influence or approval. Finding the job had been an exercise in rebuilding my professional confidence. After Marcus had successfully maneuvered to have the Morrison account reassigned to him, I realized that staying at Sterling and Associates would mean constant manipulation and sabotage. He would use every connection, every shared history, every professional relationship to undermine my work and control. My career trajectory. Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that leaving wasn't running away. It was strategic thinking. You can't heal in the same environment that made you sick, she'd said during one of our sessions. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to remove yourself from a toxic situation entirely. The job search had been terrifying at first. Marcus had spent 3 years convincing me that my success was largely due to his guidance and support. Without him, would anyone else recognize my abilities? Was I actually good at marketing, or had I been coasting on his reputation and connections? But as I updated my resume and portfolio, I was amazed by what I found. 3 years of solid work. Successful campaigns, measurable results that had nothing to do with Marcus's involvement. The Building Bridges Community Center campaign had increased their volunteer participation by 40% and their donation levels by 60%. My social media strategy for Patterson Industries had grown their online engagement by 300% in 6 months. The Morrison Electronics rebranding had resulted in a 30% increase in sales within the first quarter after launch. These weren't Marcus's achievements that I'd helped with. They were my achievements that he tried to claim credit for, Meridian Creative Group was exactly the kind of company I dreamed of working for. Mid-sized, innovative, with a client base that included nonprofits alongside corporate accounts. During my interview with the creative director, Amanda Chun, I felt like I was speaking a language I'd forgotten I knew fluently. Tell me about your approach to campaign development, Amanda said, reviewing my portfolio. I believe in understanding the client's core mission first, I replied, feeling more confident with each word. Not just what they're selling or promoting, but why it matters to them and why it should matter to their audience. Then I work backward from that emotional connection to develop messaging and visuals that feel authentic rather than manufactured. Amanda smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking we value here. Too many agencies focus on cleverness over connection. Can you walk me through how you applied that philosophy to the Morrison Electronics campaign? For the first time in months, I got to talk about my work without having to share credit or downplay my contributions. I explained my research into their target demographic, my insight that their customers weren't just buying electronics, but investing in their hobbies and passions, my strategy of positioning the company as enablers of creativity rather than just product sellers. Impressive, Amanda said when I finished. The sales results speak for themselves, but I'm more interested in your strategic thinking. You clearly understand that marketing is about building relationships, not just pushing products. I got the job offer 2 days later. Marcus found out about my new position within a week. The marketing community at our city wasn't huge and word traveled fast. His reaction was predictably manipulative. He called from a number I didn't recognize, catching me off guard before I could screen the call. Congratulations on the new job, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Meridian's a good company. Small, but good. Thank you, I replied cautiously. I heard you're working on the Riverside Community Foundation account there. Interesting that you're going back to nonprofit work. I always thought you had bigger ambitions than that. The dig was subtle but clear. I was settling for less, moving backward in my career, proving that I couldn't handle the real business world without his guidance. I am excited about the opportunity, I said simply, refusing to justify my choices to him. Of course you are. I'm just surprised Amanda Chun would put someone with your level of experience on such a small account, but I'm sure you'll do fine. Every word was calculated to make me doubt my decision, to plant seeds of insecurity about my new role. The old Clarice would have spent days analyzing his comments, wondering if he was right, if I'd made a mistake by leaving Sterling and Associates. New Clarice hung up on him. Working at Meridian felt like breathing freely for the first time in years. Amanda Chun was everything Marcus wasn't as a manager, supportive without being controlling, confident in her authority without needing to diminish others, focused on results rather than office politics. During our first team meeting, she introduced me to the rest of the creative staff with genuine enthusiasm. Clarice comes to us with extensive experience in integrated marketing campaigns, she said. Her work on community engagement and brand storytelling is exactly the expertise we've been looking for. No qualifications, no subtle undermining, no suggestions that I was there on anything other than my own merits. It was revolutionary. The Riverside Community Foundation account that Marcus had dismissively mentioned turned out to be one of the most rewarding projects of my career. The foundation provided grants to local nonprofits, but their messaging had become stale and bureaucratic over the years. Donation levels were declining, and community awareness of their impact was minimal. I spent weeks researching their grant recipients, interviewing program directors and beneficiaries, understanding the real stories behind the statistics. What I discovered was a network of organizations doing incredible work feeding homeless families, providing job training for formerly incarcerated individuals, offering art therapy to trauma survivors, teaching financial literacy in underserved communities. The campaign I developed focused on these stories. Seeds of Change position the foundation not as a distant charity, but as neighbors investing in neighbors. Instead of abstract appeals for donations, we created a series of mini documentaries featuring real people whose lives had been transformed by foundation-funded programs. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Online donations increased by 150% in the first month. Local media picked up several of the stories, generating free publicity worth thousands of dollars. Most importantly, 3 major corporate sponsors reached out about funding partnerships after seeing the campaign. "This is exactly the kind of work that makes me proud to be in this business," Amanda said during our campaign review meeting. "You didn't just create marketing materials, you told stories that mattered. That's the difference between advertising and advocacy." For my next project, Amanda assigned me to lead the team working on a rebranding campaign for a local tech startup. It was exactly the kind of high-profile corporate account that Marcus would have insisted was too advanced for my skill level. "Think you're ready for something this complex?" Amanda asked with a smile that suggested she already knew the answer. "I'm excited for the challenge," I replied, and meant it as I settled into my new role. I began to understand how much Marcus's constant criticism had limited my professional growth. At Sterling & Associates, I'd been so focused on proving I deserved to be there, on avoiding his disapproval, that I played it safe with every project. I pitched ideas I knew he would approve of rather than concepts that truly excited me. At Meridian, freed from that psychological constraint, my creativity flourished. I found myself proposing bold strategies, experimenting with innovative formats, pushing boundaries in ways I never dared before. The tech startup project became a showcase for everything I'd learned about integrated marketing. Instead of traditional advertising, I developed a content strategy that positioned the company's founders as thought leaders in their industry. We created a podcast series where they interviewed other entrepreneurs, a blog that offered practical advice for small business owners, and a social media presence that focused on community building rather than product promotion. 6 months later, the startup secured its first major round of venture capital funding. The investors specifically mentioned the company's strong brand, presence, and community engagement as factors in their decision. "You've built something special here," Amanda told me as we celebrated the successful funding announcement. "This isn't just good marketing, this is strategic brand building that will serve them for years to come." That evening, I looked at my bank account and realized something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. I was not only financially independent, but I was actually saving money without Marcus's pressure to maintain expensive appearances, without the constant stress eating away at my health and productivity. I was thriving in ways I'd never expected. The paycheck from Meridian represented more than income, it was evidence of my worth in the world, proof that I could not only survive without Marcus, but actually excel beyond anything I'd achieved with him. For the first time in years, I was excited about my future, confident in my abilities, and proud of the work I was doing. That small direct deposit every 2 weeks was a reminder that I built something real, something valuable, something entirely my own. Marcus had been wrong about everything, but he'd been most wrong about this. I wasn't nothing without him, was everything I'd always been, finally free to prove it. The evidence folder started as a simple manila file with Marcus documentation written in my careful handwriting across the tab. By the time I finished compiling everything, it had grown into 3 thick binders organized with color-coded tabs and cross-reference documentation that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. It began almost by accident. During one of my therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, she suggested I WRT down specific incidents of manipulation or professional sabotage rather than speaking about them in general terms. "Emotional abuse leaves invisible wounds," she explained, "but that doesn't mean the evidence isn't there. You have emails, text messages, witnesses to conversations. These aren't just your memories, they're documented facts." At first, I resisted the idea. It felt petty, vindictive, like I was building a case for revenge rather than focusing on healing. But Dr. Martinez reframed it differently. "This isn't about punishing Marcus," she said. "This is about validating your experiences and protecting yourself from future manipulation. Abusers rely on their victims forgetting or doubting what really happened. Documentation is a tool for maintaining your grip on reality." So I started small. I printed out the text messages Marcus had sent after our breakup, the ones that alternated between love bombing and threats. I made copies of emails where he'd taken credit for my work, conversations where he'd CD supervisors to make himself look collaborative while subtly undermining my contributions. What I discovered was both shocking and validating. The patterns Dr. Martinez had helped me identify were even clearer in black and white. Marcus's manipulation wasn't random or emotional. It was systematic, calculated, and thoroughly documented in his own words. The first section of my folder was labeled Professional Sabotage. It included email chains where Marcus had volunteered to help me with client presentations, then had gradually taken over until I was relegated to a supporting role. Screenshots of internal communications where he'd expressed concerns about my emotional stability or professional judgment. Records of meetings where he'd presented my ideas as collaborative efforts while taking lead credit. The most damning piece of evidence was an email Marcus had sent to Janet Morrison after I'd been assigned the Peterson campaign. I'm worried about Clarice's ability to handle a client this demanding, he'd written. Her anxiety has been affecting her work quality lately, and I don't want the company's reputation to suffer. Perhaps I should take the lead on this one and let her assist where appropriate. Reading that email months later, I felt a familiar surge of anger. Marcus had deliberately sabotaged my confidence through constant criticism and gaslighting, then used my resulting anxiety as evidence that I was unfit for professional responsibility. It was psychological warfare disguised as concerned collegiality. The second section was personal manipulation, filled with screenshots of his text messages, copies of those handwritten letters he'd left at my apartment, and notes I'd made during therapy about specific conversations. Reading through these chronologically, I could trace the evolution of his control tactics, how they'd started as seemingly loving concern, and gradually escalated to isolation and threats. One series of text messages was particularly revealing. After I'd started therapy, Marcus had begun a campaign to undermine my trust in Dr. Martinez. I'm worried your therapist is putting ideas in your head about our relationship. She doesn't know us or understand what we've built together. Therapy can be helpful, but some therapists have their own agendas. They make money by convincing people their relationships are unhealthy. I've been reading about therapists who encourage women to leave perfectly good relationships. It's actually a documented phenomenon. At the time, these messages had planted seeds of doubt about Dr. Martinez's motives. Now, seeing them collected together, I could recognize them as a classic abuser tactic isolating the victim from sources of support and external perspective. The third section was the most disturbing, pattern of behavior with others. As I'd begun to research Marcus's history and talk to former colleagues, I discovered that I wasn't his first victim. The breakthrough came when I ran into Lisa Chun at a coffee shop downtown. Lisa had worked at Sterling & Associates 2 years before I was hired, and I'd always wondered why such a talented designer had left for a lower-paying position at a smaller firm. Clarice, she said when she spotted me in line. How are you? I heard you left Sterling too. We ended up talking for 2 hours, and what Lisa told me was both horrifying and familiar. Marcus had used identical tactics with her taking credit for her design concepts, undermining her confidence, isolating her from colleagues, and eventually having her transferred to less visible projects when she'd started to resist his control. He was so subtle about it, Lisa said. I started to think I was losing my mind. My work was good, I knew it was good, but somehow every project I touched ended up being presented as Marcus's idea with my valuable input. Did you ever report it? Lisa laughed bitterly. Report what? That my boyfriend was too supportive? That he was helping me navigate office politics? Marcus was brilliant at making his manipulation look like mentorship. Your boyfriend? We dated for about 8 months. It started professional, then became personal, then became completely consuming. He had opinions about everything: my clothes, my friends, my career goals. When I finally broke up with him, he made my work life so miserable that I had to quit. The parallels were chilling. Marcus hadn't just manipulated me, he had a pattern, a system, a practice of targeting talented women and systematically destroying their confidence and independence. Lisa put me in touch with 2 other women who'd had similar experiences with Marcus at previous jobs. Sarah Patterson had been at his first company out of college. Jennifer Walsh, the woman he'd been cheating with during our engagement, had her own story of manipulation and professional exploitation. Each conversation added another layer to my understanding of who Marcus really was. This wasn't a man who had relationship problems or communication issues. This was a predator who had refined his techniques over years of practice. He made me feel like I was crazy, Sarah told me during a phone conversation. Every time I questioned something he did, he had an explanation that made me feel petty and paranoid. When I finally figured out what was happening, I was so damaged I could barely function at work. Jennifer's story was the most recent and perhaps the most painful to hear. I thought I was different, she said. I thought you really loved me, that what happened with you was just him being confused about what he wanted. But as soon as you were out of the picture, he started the same patterns with me, taking credit for my ideas, questioning my judgment, making me feel dependent on his approval. What made you realize what was happening? He tried to get me to sabotage another woman at work, the new marketing associate they hired to replace you. He wanted me to report concerns about her competence to management, to help build a case for her removal. That's when I understood that this was just what he did. He found talented women, used them, then destroyed them when they were no longer useful. Each of these conversations was carefully documented in my folder. Phone records, email exchanges, witness statements that painted a clear picture of Marcus's predatory behavior spanning multiple jobs and relationships. The final section was labeled Current Status and contained evidence of his continued attempts to control and punish me after our breakup. Screenshots of social media posts where he'd made subtle references to ungrateful partners and career opportunities wasted by emotional instability. Records of his attempts to contact my new employer with concerns about my professional reliability. Most troubling were the indirect methods he used to monitor my activities. He created fake social media profiles to follow my accounts. He'd shown up at events he knew I'd be attending, always with plausible explanations for his presence. He'd cultivated friendships with my former colleagues who would inadvertently provide him with information about my new job and personal life. As the folder grew thicker, I began to understand that my situation was more serious than I'd initially realized. This wasn't just a bad breakup with a manipulative ex-boyfriend. This was systematic stalking and harassment by someone who viewed me as property he'd lost rather than a person who'd made an independent choice. Dr. Martinez reviewed the documentation during one of our sessions, her expression growing more serious as she flipped through the organized evidence. Clarice, this is extensive and concerning, she said finally. Have you considered that this might constitute grounds for a restraining order? The thought hadn't occurred to me. I don't know if what he's doing is technically illegal. Harassment doesn't have to be overtly threatening to be harmful. The pattern you've documented here shows systematic efforts to control, monitor, and sabotage your life. That's stalking behavior. Looking at the folder objectively as evidence rather than personal history, I could see what Dr. Martinez meant. This wasn't the behavior of someone who was hurt or confused about our breakup. This was the behavior of someone who couldn't accept that his victim had escaped his control. The folder had started as a way to validate my own experiences and maintain my grip on reality. But as it grew, it became something else. A weapon for justice, a tool for protection, and proof that I wasn't. The problem in our relationship, Marcus, was and now I had 3 binders full of evidence to prove it. The email that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, almost exactly 1 year after I'd ended my engagement to Marcus. The sender was someone I'd never heard of, Rachel Morrison, with a subject line that made my hands shake. As I read it, regarding Marcus Reed, important information. I stared at the email for several minutes before opening it, somehow knowing that whatever it contained would alter the careful stability I'd built over the past 12 months. When I finally clicked on it, Rachel's message was both brief and devastating. Dear Clarice, I hope you don't mind me contacting you. I got your email address from Lisa Chun, who thought we should connect. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I'm currently working at Sterling & Associates in the marketing department. I believe you know Marcus Reed. I've been documenting some concerning behavior from Marcus related to my work and professional treatment. Lisa mentioned that you might have had similar experiences. I'm reaching out because I think Marcus is doing to me what he did to you, and I could use support from someone who understands what this feels like. If you're willing to talk, I would be very grateful for any advice or guidance. You could offer. Thank you for your time. Rachel Morrison. My first instinct was to delete the email and pretend I never received it. I worked so hard to move past Marcus's manipulation and build a new life. Did I really want to get pulled back into that toxic world, even to help someone else? But then I remembered how isolated I felt during the worst period of my relationship with Marcus, how desperately I'd wished for someone who could validate my experiences and help me understand what was happening. If this Rachel was going through something similar, she deserved the support I never had. I called her that afternoon. "Thank you so much for reaching out," Rachel said when I introduced myself. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. I recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice of someone who'd been systematically convinced that her perceptions couldn't be trusted. "Lisa said you're having problems with Marcus at work." "Problems" feels like an understatement, Rachel said with a bitter laugh. "I started at Sterling 6 months ago, and Marcus was assigned as my mentor. At first, he seemed incredibly supportive and knowledgeable. But lately, you've started feeling like you can't do anything, right?" "Yes." "Exactly. He points out mistakes I swear I didn't make, takes credit for strategies I developed. It makes me feel like I'm constantly on the verge of being fired. But when I try to explain what's happening to other people, it sounds like I'm being paranoid or ungrateful." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Rachel describing a pattern of behavior that was horrifyingly familiar. Marcus had started by positioning himself as her mentor and advocate, then gradually began undermining her confidence and taking credit for her work. The gaslighting, the professional sabotage, the way he made his manipulation look like helpful guidance, it was all exactly what I'd experienced. "The worst part," Rachel said, "is that he's started asking me personal questions about my relationship status, my living situation, whether I'm happy in the city. It feels like he's testing boundaries, seeing how receptive I might be to a more personal relationship." My stomach dropped. "Rachel, whatever you do, don't get involved with him romantically. That's when the real control begins. Is that what happened with you?" I gave her the abbreviated version of my story, how the professional manipulation had evolved into personal control, how Marcus had systematically isolated me from friends and family, how he'd used my own success against me by claiming credit for my achievements. "I thought I was going crazy," Rachel said when I finished. "He has this way of making you question everything you know about yourself. That's exactly what he does. And the longer you stay in his orbit, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before you started reshaping your reality." After we hung up, I found myself angry in a way I hadn't been since the early days after my breakup with Marcus. It was one thing for him to have manipulated me. I'd been young, inexperienced, vulnerable to his tactics. But knowing that he was continuing the same pattern with new victims, that he'd learned nothing from our relationship except how to be more efficient in his manipulation, was infuriating. I called Lisa Chun that evening. "I'm glad Rachel reached out to you," Lisa said when I told her about our conversation. "She's been struggling for months, and management thinks she's just having trouble adjusting to the corporate environment. Is Marcus doing the same things to her that he did to us? Worse, if anything, he's gotten more sophisticated about it. He documents everything he does to help her, so if she complains, he has evidence of being a supportive mentor. But he also documents everything she does wrong or everything he claims she does wrong, so he can build a case for her incompetence if needed. That's diabolical. It's also effective. Rachel's brilliant portfolio from her previous job is incredible, but Marcus has her convinced she's barely competent. She's started making actual mistakes because she's so anxious about making mistakes." The conversation with Lisa sparked an idea that kept me awake most of that night. What if Rachel wasn't Marcus's only current victim? What if there were other women at Sterling or at his previous companies who were experiencing similar treatment but didn't understand what was happening to them? I spent the next week reaching out to former colleagues and doing research on Marcus's professional history. What I discovered was a pattern spanning 8 years and 4 different companies. At each job, Marcus had targeted talented women, typically newer employees who were ambitious, but still establishing themselves professionally. The pattern was always the same: initial mentorship and support, gradual undermining of confidence, taking credit for their work. and finally either driving them to quit or having them reassigned to lesser positions when they became too resistant to his control. But I also discovered something else. Marcus's tactics were becoming less effective as his reputation grew. Word was spreading quietly through the industry about his treatment of female colleagues. Several companies had passed him over for promotions, and I'd heard rumors that Sterling was considering transferring him to a different department, the different department. Final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, Jennifer Walsh, the woman Marcus had been cheating with during our engagement. She called me 3 weeks after my conversation with Rachel. "I know this is awkward," Jennifer said, "but I need to tell you something. About Marcus and about what he's doing at work." "Okay." "After you left Sterling, Marcus and I dated for about 4 months. During that time, he told me things about you, about other women he'd worked with, about his strategies for managing what he called difficult female colleagues." My hands clenched around the phone. "What kind of strategies?" "He called it talent management. He said that women in marketing often had good creative instincts, but lacked the strategic thinking and client relations, skills needed for leadership. So he would take the good ideas they generated and present them in ways that clients and management would actually respect. He told you this directly. He made it sound noble, like he was helping women succeed in a male-dominated industry by giving their work the credibility it needed. But as I listened to him talk about it, I realized he was describing systematic theft of intellectual property. Jennifer had broken up with Marcus when she realized the extent of his manipulation, but not before he'd shared detailed information about his methods and his current targets. According to her, Marcus had files on several female colleagues that included psychological profiles, notes about their insecurities and vulnerabilities, and strategies for maximizing their productivity while minimizing their professional advancement. "He keeps everything," Jennifer told me. "Emails, performance reviews, client feedback, anything he can use to support his narrative about these women being talented but unstable. It's like he's building insurance policies in case anyone ever challenges his version of events." "Does anyone at Sterling know about this?" "I don't think management understands the scope of it, but some of the other women are starting to talk to each other. Rachel Morrison isn't the only one who's figured out something's wrong." That conversation convinced me that staying silent was no longer an option. Marcus wasn't just a bad ex-boyfriend who treated me poorly, he was a workplace predator who was systematically damaging women's careers and psychological well-being. But I also knew that individual complaints against Marcus had been ineffective in the past. His documentation and manipulation tactics were too sophisticated, his reputation with management too solid. If anything was going to change, it would require a coordinated effort with multiple witnesses and extensive evidence. That's when I decided to reach out to every woman I could find who'd been affected by Marcus's behavior, not for revenge, not for personal satisfaction, but for justice and to prevent him from continuing to destroy other women's careers and confidence. The whistleblower email I sent to 5 different women was simple and direct. "If Marcus Reed has affected your work or well-being in ways that felt systematic or deliberate, you're not alone and you're not imagining it. There are others who have had similar experiences, and together we might be able to create accountability where individual complaints have failed. If you're interested in learning more, please reply to this email. We're stronger together than any of us were alone." 4 women replied within 24 hours dot by the end of the week. We had 7. Marcus Reed was about to discover that his victims had found each other, and that his carefully constructed system of manipulation was about to be exposed for what it really was. The USB drive was smaller than my thumb, but it contained enough evidence to end Marcus's career and validate the experience of 7 women who'd spent years questioning their own perceptions. 2 months before the reunion, I'd spent a weekend organizing every piece of documentation we collected into a comprehensive presentation. Rachel Morrison had provided emails and performance reviews from Marcus's current manipulation campaign. Lisa Chun had contributed design files showing how Marcus had claimed credit for her creative concepts. Sarah Patterson had screenshots of text messages from their relationship 5 years earlier that showed identical manipulation tactics to the ones he'd used with me. Most damning were the recordings Jennifer Walsh had made during their brief relationship when Marcus had bragged about his talent management strategies. In his own words, captured on her phone during casual conversations, he described his systematic approach to identifying, manipulating, and exploiting talented women. The key is to make them dependent on your validation, his voice explained on one recording. You establish yourself as the expert on their capabilities. Then you slowly adjust their self-perception until they can't function professionally without your approval. It's actually quite simple once you understand the psychology. Jennifer had been wearing a wire app on her phone during those conversations, initially because she'd been confused by the discrepancies between Marcus's public persona and his private comments. By the time she understood what she was documenting, she had hours of recordings that revealed the calculated nature of his abuse. The presentation I created was organized like a legal case. It started with an overview of Marcus's pattern of behavior across multiple companies and relationships, then provided specific examples of corroborating evidence. Each woman's experience was documented with emails, text messages, performance reviews, and witness statements that showed how Marcus had systematically undermined their confidence while taking credit for their work. But the most powerful section was the financial analysis I conducted. Using salary information and promotion records I'd obtained through industry contacts, I calculated the economic impact of Marcus's behavior on his victims' careers. The total was staggering. Over $300,000 in lost wages, delayed promotions, and forced job changes across the 7 women we'd identified. He didn't just hurt us emotionally, I'd told the group during one of our planning meetings. He damaged our earning potential and professional advancement in ways that will affect us for years. As the reunion approached, I wrestled with whether to go through with my plan. Exposing Marcus publicly felt risky, potentially opening me up to legal retaliation or professional backlash. But every time I considered backing down, I remembered Rachel Morrison's voice during our first phone call, that shaky uncertainty of someone who'd been convinced she was losing her mind. Dr. Martinez had helped me work through the ethical implications during our sessions. What are your motivations for exposing this information? She asked. Partly justice, I admitted. I want Marcus to face consequences for what he's done, but mostly prevention. If we don't speak up, he'll keep doing this to other women. And you're prepared for his response? I'd thought about that extensively. Marcus wouldn't take public exposure quietly. He'd likely claim the accusations were coordinated lies from bitter ex-girlfriends and disgruntled employees. He might threaten legal action, try to discredit our evidence, or attempt to turn our own documentation against us. But the beauty of our case was its comprehensiveness. We had evidence from multiple sources spanning 8 years. We had recordings of Marcus describing his tactics in his own words. We had financial records, performance evaluations, and witness statements from colleagues who'd observed his behavior firsthand. Most importantly, we had each other. Marcus's power had always come from isolating his victims, making each woman feel like she was the only one experiencing his manipulation. But together, our shared experiences created an undeniable pattern that couldn't be dismissed as individual personality conflicts, professional misunderstandings. The presentation on the USB drive was titled simply The Marcus Reed Files, a pattern of professional manipulation and personal abuse. It contained 247 pages of evidence, organized into 7 sections corresponding to each victim's experience, plus a comprehensive analysis section that tied everything together. I'd spent weeks perfecting the timing and delivery. The reunion would provide the perfect audience, our former classmates, many of whom now held senior positions in marketing and related industries. These were people who knew both Marcus and me from college, who could evaluate our credibility based on years of shared history. But the presentation wasn't just about Marcus. It was about education. Too many people in our industry didn't understand how workplace manipulation functioned, how abusers used professional environments to damage their victims while maintaining plausible deniability. Our case study would help people recognize these patterns in their own workplaces. The technical aspects had been handled by David Chanlisa's brother, who worked in IT security and had helped us organize our digital evidence in ways that would be legally admissible if needed. He'd also created backup copies of everything, stored in multiple locations, so that Marcus couldn't suppress the information even if he attempted legal action. "You've built a bulletproof case," David told me when he delivered the final USB drive. "The documentation is comprehensive, the chain of custody is clear, and everything is backed up with independent verification. If Marcus tries to claim this is fabricated, the technical evidence will prove otherwise." The night before the reunion, I'd sat in my apartment with the small USB drive, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years earlier, I'd been a broken woman who questioned her own reality, convinced that her perceptions couldn't be trusted. Now I was holding evidence that could protect other women from experiencing what I'd endured. The phone call from Sarah Patterson that evening had reinforced my resolve. "I just wanted to thank you again for organizing this," she said. "I've been in therapy for 3 years trying to recover from what Marcus did to my self-esteem and career. Knowing that other women experience the same things, seeing our stories documented and validated's been incredibly healing." "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but also excited. For the first time since I knew Marcus, I feel like I have power in our dynamic. He spent so much time convincing me I was weak and unstable. Tomorrow he's going to see exactly how strong I really am." That was the sentiment I'd heard from all 7 women. Marcus had targeted us because we were talented, ambitious, and successful. But his attempts to diminish us had ultimately revealed our resilience. We'd survived his manipulation, rebuilt our lives, and now we were using our combined strength to hold him accountable. The USB drive contained more than evidence. It contained our reclaimed power, our validated experiences, and our commitment to preventing other women from suffering as we had done as I prepared for bed. I thought about Marcus receiving his reunion invitation months earlier, probably looking forward to an evening of nostalgia and networking. He had no idea that 7 women he'd wronged had spent months preparing to confront him with the truth about his behavior. The reunion wouldn't just be a social gathering. It would be a reckoning dot, and for the first time in years, Marcus Reed wouldn't control the narrative. The USB drive sat on my nightstand as I fell asleep, a small device containing enough truth to change everything. Tomorrow, Marcus would discover that his victims had found their voices, their strength, and their power, and there would be nowhere for him to run. The microphone was heavier than I'd expected, but my hands were steady as I held it. 10 years after graduation, standing in the ballroom of the Riverside Hotel where our reunion was being held, I felt more confident than I had since college. Marcus had arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that drew attention from across the room. He looked successful, expensive suit, confident smile, the same charismatic presence that had first attracted me in the campus coffee shop. For a moment, watching him work the room and shake hands with former classmates, I felt a flicker of the old self-doubt. Then I remembered the USB drive in my purse, the 7 women who trusted me with their stories, and the 2 years of healing. That had brought me to this moment. The reunion had started as typical alumni events do: cocktails, name tags with graduation photos, conversations about careers and families, and the passage of time. I'd reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, caught up on marriages and divorces and career changes, laughed about professors we'd loved and courses we'd struggled through. Marcus had spotted me early in the evening, approaching with that familiar confidence that used to make my heart race. Now it just made me alert. "Clarice," he said, leaning in for a hug I didn't return, "you look wonderful. I heard you're doing well at that new agency. Meridian Creative." "Yes, I'm very happy." "There, that's great, really great." His smile was practiced, perfect. "I've been hoping we'd have a chance to talk. I know things ended badly between us, but I've learned a lot since then. About myself, about relationships. I think we could both benefit from clearing the air." It was a masterful performance, humble, mature, slightly vulnerable. The old Clarice would have been drawn into this conversation, eager to believe that Marcus had genuinely changed and that closure was possible. The new Clarice recognized it as another manipulation tactic. "I think our air is perfectly clear," I said evenly. "If you'll excuse me, I want to catch up with some other friends." I walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone with his practiced apology dying on his lips. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. The evening's program included the usual reunion activities awards for various achievements, a memorial for classmates who passed away, updates from the Alumni Association. But I knew the real program would begin when they opened the floor for classmates to share updates about their lives and careers. Marcus, predictably, was one of the first to request the microphone. "Hi, everyone," he said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system. "For those who don't remember me, I'm Marcus Reed. I've been working in marketing since graduation. Currently senior director at Sterling and Associates here." In town, there was polite applause. Marcus had always been well-liked and college-charming, involved in multiple organizations, the kind of person who seemed destined for success. "I wanted to take a moment to talk about mentorship," he continued, "because I think it's one of the most important aspects of building a successful career. Over the past several years, I've had the privilege of mentoring several talented young women in our industry, helping them navigate the challenges of professional development and build sustainable careers." My stomach twisted as I recognized what he was doing. Marcus was positioning himself as a champion of women's advancement, using his history of manipulation as evidence of his commitment to female empowerment. "It's incredibly rewarding to see these women grow into confident, capable professionals," he said, his voice warm with false sincerity. "Some of them are here tonight, actually. I've been blessed to work with brilliant women like Jennifer Walsh, Lisa Chun, and even my former fiancée, Clarice Truman, who I understand is doing excellent work at Meridian Creative." The mention of my name, delivered with that proprietary tone that suggested ongoing connection and influence, was the final straw. Marcus was claiming credit for my success, positioning our abusive relationship as career mentorship, turning my recovery into evidence of his beneficial impact. I stood up from my table and walked toward the small stage where he was speaking. "Actually, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room, "I'd like to address that." The room fell silent. Marcus's expression shifted from confident to wary, but he couldn't refuse to hand over the microphone without looking petty and controlling, in front of our classmates. "Of course," he said, passing me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure everyone would love to hear about your success." I took the microphone and looked out at the faces of people I'd known for over a decade. Some looked curious, others confused by the sudden tension. A few Lisa Chun, David Martinez, who'd been in our study group, Sarah Williams, who'd been my college roommate, watched with expressions of supportive anticipation. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You're right that my career has been successful, but I need to correct something important about your role in that success." I pulled the USB drive from my purse and held it up. What Marcus describes as mentorship, I and several other women experienced as systematic manipulation and professional abuse. The guidance he provided involved taking credit for our work, undermining our confidence, and using personal relationships to control our career advancement. The room was completely silent now. I could see Marcus in my peripheral vision. His face flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. Over the past several months, 7 women who worked with Marcus at various companies have shared their experiences. The pattern is consistent, documented, and undeniable. Marcus targets talented women, positions himself as their mentor and advocate, then systematically undermines their confidence while claiming credit for their achievements. I connected the USB drive to the presentation system that had been set up for the reunion slideshow. The first slide appeared on the screen behind me. The Marcus Reed files, a pattern of professional manipulation and personal abuse. "Marcus told you that he helped build my career," I continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a timeline of my professional achievements alongside instances of his sabotage. "The truth is that he stole my ideas, presented them as his own, and used my success to advance his own career while consistently undermining my confidence and professional standing." The evidence flowed across the screen emails, text messages, performance reviews, financial analysis. Each slide built the case more comprehensively, showing not just my experience, but the pattern across multiple victims. Marcus tried to interrupt. "Clarice, this is inappropriate. You're clearly still angry about our breakup, but this isn't the place. This is exactly the place," I said, my voice cutting through his objection. "Because you just stood here and lied to our classmates about your treatment of women in our industry. You used your relationship with me as evidence of your character, so it's appropriate for me to provide the actual facts about that relationship." I clicked to a slide showing the recordings Jennifer Walsh had made. These are Marcus's own words, describing his strategies for what he called talent management, his system for identifying, manipulating, and exploiting talented women. Marcus's voice filled the room through the audio system, casual and confident, as he described his manipulation tactics to Jennifer. The room's atmosphere shifted palpably as our classmates heard him explain how he made women dependent on his validation and adjusted their self-perception to maintain control. The 7 women affected by Marcus's behavior have lost over $300,000 in combined wages and advancement opportunities. I continued, clicking through slides that showed the financial impact, but the psychological damage is immeasurable. Marcus's mentorship left each of us questioning our abilities, our perceptions, and our worth. I could see the shock and disgust on faces throughout the room. These were people who knew Marcus from college, who trusted his persona of supportive leadership. Hearing evidence of his systematic abuse was clearly devastating to many of them. "I'm sharing this information not for revenge, but for protection," I said, moving to my final slides. "Marcus continues to target women in our industry. As long as his behavior remains hidden, he'll keep damaging careers and lives. The only way to stop predators like this is to expose their patterns and hold them accountable." The final slide showed contact information for workplace, harassment resources, and a statement from all 7 women involved. If anyone has experienced similar treatment from Marcus or witnessed his behavior toward female colleagues, we encourage you to document it and report it. Professional abuse thrives in silence. I handed the microphone back to Marcus, who stood frozen on the stage, his face pale and his confident facade completely shattered. The room remained silent for several long moments before scattered applause began, growing into sustained clapping from about half the attendees. "Thank you," I said simply, then walked back to my table. Marcus took the microphone with shaking hands, his voice much less steady than it had been minutes earlier. "Obviously, Clarice is still dealing with some personal issues related to our breakup," he said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "These accusations are actually Marcus," interrupted David Martinez, rising from his table near the front of the room. David had become a human resources director at a major corporation since graduation. "I think what Clarice has presented deserves serious consideration rather than dismissal. The documentation appears comprehensive, and the pattern she's described matches behaviors I've seen investigated in professional settings." Another classmate, Jennifer Park, who'd become employment attorney, also stood. "The recordings alone constitute significant evidence of discriminatory practices. If these allegations are accurate, they represent serious violations of workplace harassment policies." One by one, more classmates stood in support. Not everyone Marcus had his defenders, people who'd known him for years and couldn't reconcile his public persona with the evidence I presented, but enough people stood that Marcus found himself facing a room where his victims had all eyes, where his manipulation was no longer invisible. "This is a coordinated attack," Marcus said desperately into the microphone. "Clarice has clearly manipulated these other women into supporting her version of events. Anyone who knows me knows I would never—" "I know you, Marcus," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Rachel Morrison walking toward the stage. She wasn't a college classmate, but somehow she'd gotten into the reunion. "I'm Rachel Morrison," she said, as Marcus reluctantly handed her the microphone. "I currently work at Sterling and Associates under Marcus's mentorship." Everything Clarice described, the systematic undermining, the credit theft, the psychological manipulation I'm experiencing right now. Rachel's voice grew stronger as she spoke. 3 weeks ago, I was ready to quit my job because Marcus had convinced me I was incompetent and unstable. Then I connected with these women and realized that my experiences weren't unique. Marcus uses the same tactics on every woman he targets. She looked directly at Marcus. You told me I was too emotional for client relations. You said my ideas needed your strategic guidance to be viable. You made me believe I was lucky you were willing to work with someone as inexperienced as me. But the truth is, you've been stealing my work and presenting it as your own, while systematically destroying my confidence. Marcus grabbed for the microphone. Rachel, you're clearly upset about some professional feedback I've given you. But no, Rachel said, pulling the microphone away from him. I'm not upset about feedback. I'm angry about abuse. And I'm not the only current victim. 3 more women walked into the ballroom, other Sterling employees who'd been coordinating with our group. The reunion had become an intervention, a public confrontation that Marcus couldn't control or manipulate. The evening dissolved into chaos after that. Marcus left quickly, muttering threats about legal action and defamation lawsuits. About half the attendees approached me to offer support or ask questions about the evidence. Several people took photos of the presentation slides, and multiple classmates asked for copies of the documentation, but the most meaningful moment came when Sarah Williams, my college roommate, hugged me tightly. I'm so proud of you, she said. In college, you were always so strong, so confident. When I heard you'd gotten engaged to Marcus, I was happy for you, but something felt off. He had this way of talking about you like you were his project rather than his partner. You never said anything. I didn't know how. But watching you tonight, seeing you reclaim your power like this, it reminds me of the woman I knew in college. The one who was going to change the world. As the evening wound down, I stood in the hotel parking lot with Lisa Chen, Rachel Morrison, and 3 other women who'd been part of our coalition. We were exhausted but exhilarated, like soldiers after a successful battle. Do you think it worked? Rachel asked. Do you think this will actually change anything? It already has, I said, looking at the hotel where Marcus had just suffered the most public humiliation of his life. He'll never be able to claim ignorance again. Everyone in our professional network now knows what he really is. But more importantly, 7 women who'd spent years questioning their own perceptions now had public validation of their experiences. We'd broken the silence that had allowed Marcus to continue his predatory behavior. We'd transformed from isolated victims into a collective force for accountability. The microphone had been heavy in my hands, but the truth it had carried was even weightier. And finally, after years of Marcus controlling the narrative about our relationship and my career, I'd gotten to tell the real story in my own voice, with my own words, on my own terms. The girl Marcus claimed to have made had shown everyone exactly who she'd become without him, and it was someone far stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. The corporate investigation report arrived 6 weeks after the reunion, thick with official letterhead and formal language that couldn't disguise the devastating conclusions about Marcus Reed's conduct. Sterling and Associates had acted swiftly. After the reunion, within 3 days, I'd received a call from their head of human resources, Patricia Wong, requesting a meeting to discuss the allegations I'd made public. We take these accusations very seriously, Patricia said when we met. In her downtown office the following week. While we can't comment on personnel matters, I want you to know that we're conducting a comprehensive review of Mr. Reed's professional conduct and his interactions with female colleagues. I brought copies of all our documentation, the emails, the recordings, the financial analysis, the witness statements. Patricia reviewed everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood the legal implications of what she was seeing. This is extremely concerning, she said after spending an hour going through the evidence. Some of these communications clearly violate our harassment policies. And the pattern of behavior you've documented raises serious questions about Mr. Reed's fitness for his supervisory role. What happens now? We'll be conducting interviews with current and former employees, reviewing personnel files and performance evaluations, and examining any complaints or concerns that may have been raised about Mr. Reed's conduct. We'll also be working with our legal department to ensure that any affected employees receive appropriate remediation. The investigation took 6 weeks and was more thorough than I dared to hope. Sterling hired an external firm specializing in workplace harassment cases to ensure objectivity. They interviewed 17 current and former employees, reviewed 4 years of Marcus's email communications, and examined performance evaluations and promotion decisions for every woman who'd worked under his supervision. The report, when it finally came, was 43 pages of methodical documentation that validated everything we'd experienced and more. The investigation has substantiated allegations of systematic workplace harassment, discrimination, and abuse of supervisory authority by Marcus Reed, the executive summary stated. Mr. Reed's conduct toward female subordinates demonstrates a consistent pattern of professional sabotage, credit appropriation, and psychological manipulation that violates multiple company policies and creates a hostile work environment. The specific findings were even more damning. Marcus had claimed credit for work products created entirely by female subordinates in 23 documented instances over 4 years. He had systematically provided negative performance evaluations for women who resisted his control while providing positive evaluations for their actual work when presenting it as his own. Had used his supervisory position to access confidential personnel information about female employees' personal lives, which he then used to manipulate their professional relationships. He had created a mentorship program that was actually a system for identifying and exploiting talented women while protecting himself from formal complaints. Through extensive documentation of his support, most significantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence that Sterling's management had received informal complaints about Marcus's behavior on multiple occasions, but had failed to investigate them properly because Marcus had successfully framed the complaints as personality conflicts or performance issues. The company acknowledges that Mr. Reed's conduct was enabled by systemic failures in our complaint and investigation processes. The report continued. Sterling and Associates accepts full responsibility for these failures and has implemented comprehensive policy changes to prevent similar situations in the future. The consequences for Marcus were swift and final. He was terminated immediately with cause, which meant no severance package and no positive references for future employment. The company also agreed to provide remediation to affected employees, including financial compensation for lost wages and professional development opportunities. But the investigation's impact extended far beyond Marcus's individual case. Sterling implemented new policies requiring multiple supervisors for mentorship programs, mandatory harassment training for all management personnel, and an independent ombudsman system for reporting workplace concerns. We want to ensure that no employee ever experiences what these women endured, Patricia Wong said when she called to update me on the investigation's outcome. Your courage in speaking out has helped us identify serious problems in our workplace culture that we're committed to addressing. The news of Marcus's termination spread quickly through the marketing community. Within days, I was receiving messages from colleagues, former classmates, and even complete strangers who wanted to share their own experiences with workplace manipulation or express support for our decision to speak out publicly. One message particularly moved me. It was from Professor Chen, my strategic marketing instructor from college, who'd heard about the reunion confrontation through the alumni network. Clarice, she wrote, I remember you as one of my most promising students, and I've followed your career with great interest. What you did at the reunion took tremendous courage, and I want you to know that it's already making a difference. I've shared your story with your permission, I hope, with my current students, as an example of how to recognize and respond to workplace abuse. You've turned your painful experience into a teaching moment that will help protect other young women. The media attention was unexpected but welcome. A local business journalist had heard about the Sterling investigation and wanted to write a story about workplace harassment in the marketing industry. I agreed to be interviewed, along with Lisa Chun and Rachel Morrison, because we felt that broader awareness could help prevent similar situations. The article, titled Breaking the Silence: How 7 Women Exposed a Pattern of Professional Abuse, ran in the city's Business Weekly and was picked up by several national publications. We started receiving invitations to speak at professional conferences and women's leadership events about recognizing and responding to workplace manipulation. But the most gratifying response came from other women who'd experienced similar treatment. My email inbox filled with messages from marketing professionals, recent graduates, and women in other industries who recognized their own experiences in our story. "I thought I was going crazy," wrote one woman. "My supervisor does exactly what you described, takes credit for my work, undermines my confidence, makes me feel like I'm lucky he tolerates my incompetence. Reading your story helped me understand that I'm not the problem." Another message came from a recent college graduate. "Your presentation has been shared in several marketing groups I'm part of. It's helping young women like me recognize red flags before we get trapped in abusive professional relationships. Thank you for turning your pain into protection for others." The corporate investigation report became a template for other companies dealing with similar issues. Patricia Wong told me that she'd received requests from HR directors at dozens of other firms asking for guidance on implementing the policy changes Sterling had developed in response to our case. "Your situation has become a case study in how workplace abuse operates and how companies can respond effectively," she said during one of our follow-up conversations. "The ripple effects of your courage to speak out are helping women across multiple industries." The financial remediation from Sterling was substantial, enough to cover the salary losses I'd experienced during the worst period of Marcus's manipulation, plus additional compensation for the psychological harm I'd endured. But more important than the money was the official acknowledgement that what I'd experienced was real, documented, and wrong. For years, Marcus had made me question my own perceptions, convinced me that his treatment was normal mentorship and my discomfort was evidence of my own inadequacy. The corporate investigation report was 43 pages of validation that my experiences were accurate, my complaints were justified, and my decision to speak out was necessary. The report concluded with a statement that felt like vindication. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mr. Reed's conduct was calculated, systematic, and designed to exploit and harm female colleagues while advancing his own career. The affected employees showed remarkable courage in coming forward, and their actions have prevented continued harm to other women in the workplace. As I held the report in my hands, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years earlier, anxious, self-doubting, convinced that I was lucky anyone was willing to work with me. That woman could never have imagined that her painful experiences would become the foundation for systemic change that could protect other women from similar abuse. The corporate investigation report was more than just a document. It was proof that truth, when spoken with courage and supported by evidence, has the power to create justice. And sometimes justice feels a lot like healing. The thank you card was handwritten on lavender stationery, the kind of personal touch that's becoming rare in our digital age. But it was the message inside that brought tears to my eyes and reminded me why speaking out had been worth every difficult moment. "Dear Clarice," it read, "my name is Emma Rodriguez, and I work at Morrison Industries here in town. I've never met you, but your story quite literally saved my career and possibly my sanity. 6 months ago, I was ready to quit marketing altogether because I was convinced I wasn't good enough for this field. Then I saw your presentation online and realized that my supervisor was using the exact same tactics you described Marcus using. Your courage to speak out gave me the courage to document his behavior and report it to HR. He was terminated last month, and I've been promoted to lead the department he used to run. I wanted you to know that your bravery created a ripple effect that reached someone you've never even met. Thank you for showing me that I wasn't crazy and I wasn't alone." Emma's card was one of dozens I'd received in the months following the reunion and the Sterling investigation. Each one told a similar story. Women who'd recognized their own experiences in my presentation found the courage to document abuse they'd been enduring and successfully fought back against workplace predators. The most heartbreaking came from a recent college graduate named Ashley Chen. "I was 3 weeks into my first job when I saw your presentation. My supervisor had already started the pattern you described, positioning himself as my mentor, while subtly undermining my confidence and taking credit for my ideas. Because of your documentation, I recognized what was happening before it could destroy my self-esteem. I reported his behavior immediately, and My company took action. You probably saved me years of therapy and career damage. But the responses weren't just from individual women. Professional organizations began inviting me to speak about workplace harassment and manipulation. The American Marketing Association asked me to develop a workshop on recognizing and responding to professional abuse. 3 universities incorporated our case study into their business ethics curricula. The most significant opportunity came from the National Women's Professional Network, which invited me to keynote their annual conference, standing before an audience of 800 professional women. Sharing the stage where speakers had included CEOs and senators felt surreal for someone who'd spent years convinced she had nothing valuable to contribute. 2 years ago, I was in an abusive relationship that had convinced me I was worthless without my abuser's guidance and approval. I told the audience. Today, I'm here because 7 women decided that our individual pain could become collective. Power for change. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, but more meaningful were the conversations afterward. Women approached me with their own stories of workplace manipulation, their strategies for fighting back, their successes in creating change within their organizations. Your presentation has become required viewing for all new hires at my company, one HR director told me. We use it to help people recognize manipulation tactics and understand that they have options for addressing abuse. A corporate attorney mentioned that she'd used our documentation methods as a template for building cases against workplace predators. The comprehensive nature of your evidence file made it impossible for the abuser to claim ignorance or misunderstanding, she said. You've created a blueprint for holding these people accountable. The ripple effects extended beyond individual cases. The marketing industry publication that had first covered our story began running a monthly series on workplace harassment, providing resources and support for professionals dealing with abusive situations. Several major agencies implemented new mentorship oversight policies directly inspired by our case. But perhaps the most gratifying development was the network of support that emerged among Marcus's victims and other women who'd experienced similar abuse. We'd started meeting monthly, initially just to process our shared experiences, but the group evolved into something more powerful, a support system for women dealing with workplace manipulation and a resource for those ready to fight back. Rachel Morrison had become one of the group's most effective advocates. After Marcus's termination, she'd been promoted to senior marketing specialist at Sterling, and she used her position to mentor other women in recognizing and responding to manipulation. Clarice showed us that we don't have to accept abuse as the price of career advancement, Rachel said during one of our meetings. Her courage to speak publicly gave all of us permission to trust our own experiences and demand better treatment. Lisa Chun had started consulting with companies on creating harassment-free workplace cultures. The documentation methods you developed have become industry standard, she told me. HR departments across the country are using your evidence-gathering techniques to build cases against abusive supervisors. Jennifer Walsh had perhaps the most dramatic transformation. She had left marketing entirely to become a victim's rights advocate, working with a nonprofit organization that helped women document and report workplace abuse. My experience with Marcus taught me how manipulation works, she explained. Now I use that knowledge to help other women recognize when they're being victimized and take action to protect themselves. The financial settlement from Sterling had allowed me to take some career risks I wouldn't have been able to afford otherwise. I'd reduced my client load at Meridian to focus on pro bono work with nonprofits, addressing workplace harassment and women's professional development. The most meaningful project was developing a training program for college seniors about recognizing workplace manipulation. Working with 3 universities, I created a curriculum that taught students how to identify red flags, document concerning behavior, and access resources for support. We're trying to inoculate young women against the kind of abuse we experienced, I explained to Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions. If they understand these patterns before entering the workforce, they'll be much harder to victimize. The therapeutic work had evolved too. Dr. Martinez and I had shifted from processing trauma to exploring how my experience could serve broader purposes. You've transformed your pain into purpose, she observed. That kind of meaning-making is one of the most powerful forms of healing. The monthly speaking engagements and consulting work had also brought unexpected personal growth. Standing in front of audiences, sharing my story with confidence and authority, was helping me reclaim the sense of self-worth that Marcus had systematically destroyed. "You've become a different person," Sarah observed during one of our regular coffee dates. "Not different from who you were before Marcus, but different from who you became during that relationship. Stronger, more confident, more purposeful." She was right. The woman speaking at conferences and consulting with corporations bore little resemblance to the anxious, self-doubting person who'd endured Marcus's manipulation. But she also wasn't the same as the naive college graduate who'd been vulnerable to his tactics in the first place. I'd become someone who understood how abuse worked, how to recognize it, and how to fight it. Someone who could help other women avoid the trap I'd fallen into, or escape it if they found themselves caught. The thank you cards kept coming from women I'd never met whose lives had been changed by our decision to speak out, from companies that had implemented better policies because of our case study, from young professionals who'd avoided abusive relationships because they'd learned to recognize the warning signs. Each card was a reminder that individual healing, when shared courageously, becomes collective power. Marcus had tried to make me smaller, more dependent, more isolated, but his abuse had ultimately connected me to a community of women committed to protecting each other and creating change. The ripple effect of speaking truth had reached far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first stood up at that reunion. We hadn't just held one predator accountable, we'd started a conversation that was helping women across multiple industries recognize their worth and demand respect. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. But sometimes it's even better. It's using your recovery to help others heal, and using your voice to make sure the truth is louder than the lies. The thank you cards proved that our courage had created something Marcus could never destroy. A legacy of empowerment that would protect women he would never have the chance to harm. The family photo from our therapy session sits on my desk now, a symbol of how healing sometimes requires examining wounds we didn't even know we carried. It had been Dr. Martinez's suggestion to include my parents in a session. About 8 months after the reunion, we'd been working through the aftermath of confronting Marcus, and I mentioned feeling confused about my family's reactions to the situation. "They're proud of me for speaking out," I told her, "but I can also sense some discomfort. Like they wish I'd handled it more privately, more quietly." "How do you feel about their reaction?" "Conflicted. Part of me understands their perspective. They come from a generation where you dealt with problems internally, where public confrontation was seen as undignified. But part of me feels like they're more concerned about appearances than about justice." Dr. Martinez had been quiet for a moment. "What do you know about your parents' relationship history? How they met, how decisions were made in their marriage?" The question had caught me off guard. I never really thought about it. They'd been married for 35 years. They seem happy. Dad worked, Mom stayed home until my sister and I were in high school, then she went back to part-time work. Pretty traditional. And growing up, how are conflicts handled in your family? I'd had to think about that. Dad usually made the final decisions about big things. Mom would express her opinions privately, but if they disagreed, she generally deferred to his judgment. They never fought in front of us. Everything was very calm and respectful. How did that dynamic affect you and your sister? I guess I learned that keeping peace was more important than being right. That women should be accommodating, supportive, not confrontational. The realization hit me as I spoke the words. "Oh, that's how I became vulnerable to Marcus, isn't it?" The family therapy session had been awkward at first. My parents, Robert and Margaret Truman, sat stiffly on Dr. Martinez's couch, clearly uncomfortable with the formal therapeutic setting. I want to understand how family patterns might have influenced Clarice's relationship with Marcus, Dr. Martinez explained. "This isn't about blame or criticism. It's about understanding how we learn to navigate relationships and where those patterns might need updating." She'd started with simple questions about their marriage, their decision-making processes, how they'd handled disagreements over the years. As they talked, patterns emerged that I'd never consciously noticed. Margaret, when you and Robert disagree about something important, how do you typically resolve it? Dr. Martinez asked. My mother glanced at my father before answering. Well, Robert usually has more experience with financial matters and practical decisions. I trust his judgment on most things. And Robert, how do you handle situations where Margaret expresses a different opinion? I listen to her perspective, of course, my father said. But ultimately, someone has to make the decision, and I've usually researched the issue more thoroughly. Dr. Martinez turned to me. Clarice, does this dynamic sound familiar from any other relationships in your life? The parallel to my relationship with Marcus was painfully obvious. The assumption that the man's perspective was more informed, more rational, more worthy of deference. The woman's role as supportive consultant rather than equal partner in decision-making. Mom, I said carefully, did you ever want to make different choices than Dad did? About big decisions, I mean. My mother looked uncomfortable. Your father has always provided well for our family. I've been very fortunate. That's not what I asked. There was a long silence before my mother spoke again, her voice quieter. There were times I had different ideas about things. The house we bought, some of your educational choices, how we spent vacations. But marriage is about compromise, and your father's decisions usually worked out well. Usually? Another pause. There was one time when you were in high school that I really wanted us to move to a different neighborhood. The schools were better, the community was more diverse, and I thought it would be good for you and your sister. But your father felt the move was unnecessary and financially risky. What happened? We stayed where we were. And you turned out fine, so his judgment was probably correct. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Margaret, how did you feel when your preference was overruled? I accepted it. That's what marriage is, trusting your partner's judgment, even when you disagree. And how did that affect how you advised Clarice about relationships? My mother's expression shifted as she began to understand the implications of the conversation. I always told her that successful relationships require flexibility and compromise, that strong women support their partners and don't create unnecessary conflict. Mom, I said gently, when I told you about problems with Marcus, what was your advice? She looked pained. I told you that all relationships have challenges and that Marcus seemed like a good man who loved you. I suggested that maybe you were being too sensitive about some of his feedback. You told me to trust his judgment over my own instincts. I thought I was helping you save your relationship. Dr. Martinez intervened. Margaret, there's nothing wrong with compromise and flexibility in relationships. But there's a difference between healthy compromise and one partner consistently deferring to the other's judgment. What we're exploring is how family patterns might have made Clarice more vulnerable to manipulation. My father had been quiet through most of this exchange, but now he spoke up. I never meant to dominate our marriage, he said to my mother. I thought I was being responsible, taking care of practical matters, so you could focus on the children and home. I know, my mother replied, and I was grateful for that. But maybe I should have spoken up more when I disagreed with your decisions. And maybe I should have asked for your input more often instead of assuming I knew what was best for our family. It was the most honest conversation I'd ever witnessed between my parents, and it was revelatory for all of us. They weren't bad people or even a dysfunctional couple, but they'd replicated patterns from their own upbringings without questioning whether those patterns served their relationship or their children. The goal isn't to judge past choices, Dr. Martinez said. It's to understand how family dynamics influence our expectations about relationships, and to consciously choose which patterns we want to continue and which ones we want to change. Over the following months, my parents began having conversations they'd avoided for decades. My mother started expressing opinions more directly, and my father began actively seeking her input on decisions he'd previously made unilaterally. Your mother had some excellent insights about our retirement planning, my father told me during one of our regular phone calls. I can't believe I never asked for her perspective on financial matters. She's actually quite savvy about investments. My mother began taking art classes. She'd wanted to pursue for years, but had always deferred because they seemed impractical. She started volunteering with a women's advocacy organization, using her experience to help other women recognize their own worth. Seeing how you fought back against Marcus made me realize I'd spent too many years not fighting for my own ideas. She told me, "I'm proud of your courage, and I want to develop some of my own." The family photo was taken at the end of our last joint therapy session, the three of us together with Dr. Martinez in her office. We looked different than we had at the beginning, of the process more honest, more connected, more aware of our individual worth within our family dynamic. "What strikes me about this process," Dr. Martinez observed as we prepared to end the session, "is how healing from abuse often requires examining the conditions that made us vulnerable to it in the first place. Clarice, you've not only recovered from Marcus's manipulation, you've helped your family break patterns that might have affected future generations." My sister Emily, who lived across the country, had been the unexpected beneficiary of our family's therapeutic work. During her last visit home, she mentioned feeling more confident about expressing disagreement with her husband about parenting decisions. Seeing Mom and Dad renegotiate their relationship and watching how you stood up to Marcus has given me permission to trust my own judgment more, she said. "I love David, but I don't need his approval for every decision I make." The generational pattern breaking felt like the most important outcome of our entire healing process. Marcus had exploited vulnerabilities that had been shaped by family dynamics spanning decades. By addressing those dynamics directly, we'd not only healed past wounds but prevented future ones. "I wish I'd understood these patterns when you were younger," my mother said during one of our follow-up conversations. "I would have taught you to trust your instincts more, to see yourself as an equal partner in relationships rather than someone who needed to earn approval through accommodation. You did the best you could with the understanding you had then," I replied. "And we're changing the pattern now, which means any daughters I might have will grow up with different expectations about their worth and their voice." The family photo serves as a reminder that healing isn't just individual, it's generational. When we have the courage to examine and change unhealthy patterns, we don't just heal ourselves. We heal our families and we protect future generations from inheriting wounds they didn't create, breaking the cycle of accommodation and deference that had made me vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation wasn't just about my recovery. It was about ensuring that the women who come after me and my family and beyond would know their worth, trust their instincts, and never accept abuse as the price of love or success. Sometimes, the most radical act of healing is simply refusing to pass on the patterns that hurt us. The legal settlement document was 17 pages of formal language that essentially amounted to 3 simple facts. Marcus Reed had violated multiple workplace harassment laws. Sterling and Associates accepted responsibility for enabling his behavior, and justice sometimes comes with a dollar amount attached. The lawsuit hadn't been my idea initially. After the corporate investigation concluded and Marcus was terminated, I felt like justice had been served. But Jennifer Park, the employment attorney who'd been our reunion, reached out to me about pursuing additional legal action. The Sterling investigation was thorough, but it only addressed company policy violations. She explained during our first meeting, "What Marcus did to you and the other women also constitutes violations of federal employment law, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and potentially civil conspiracy. You have grounds for significant legal remediation beyond what Sterling has offered." I'd been reluctant at first. The reunion confrontation and corporate investigation have been about accountability and prevention, not financial gain. But Jennifer helped me understand that legal action could serve broader purposes. "Civil lawsuits create public record," she said. "They establish legal precedent that other victims can use in their own cases. And significant financial penalties send a message to other potential abusers that this behavior has real consequences." The decision became easier when I learned that Marcus had found new employment at Morrison Industries, the same company where Emma Rodriguez worked, the woman who'd sent me the thank you card. Despite his termination from Sterling and the public exposure of his behavior, Marcus had managed to convince Morrison's hiring manager that he'd been the victim of a coordinated attack by disgruntled former colleagues. "He's already started targeting women at Morrison," Rachel Morrison told me during one of our support group meetings. Emma says he's using more subtle tactics now, but the pattern is the same. He's learned how to be more careful about leaving evidence. That's when I realized that accountability without consequences was just performance. Marcus had faced professional embarrassment and lost one job, but he quickly found another opportunity to continue his predatory behavior. Real justice required more than exposure. It required costs. Jennifer Park assembled a legal team that included 2 other employment attorneys and a specialist in workplace harassment cases. They spent 6 months building our case, interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents, and researching legal precedent. The evidence we'd already compiled for the reunion presentation and Sterling investigation became the foundation of our legal filing. But the attorneys uncovered additional material that painted an even more comprehensive picture of Marcus's systematic abuse. We found evidence that Marcus had been using similar tactics at 3 previous employers, Jennifer told me during one of our case preparation meetings. This isn't just workplace harassment. It's a pattern of serial predatory behavior spanning nearly a decade. The financial impact analysis was particularly damaging to Marcus's case. The attorneys calculated not just the immediate salary losses I'd experienced, but the long-term career impact of his manipulation. Delayed promotions, missed opportunities, the psychological cost of rebuilding my professional confidence, all translated into concrete financial harm that could be legally remedied. Your career trajectory was significantly altered by Marcus's actions, Jennifer explained. Without his interference, you would likely have advanced to senior positions much earlier. The lifetime earning potential lost to his abuse is substantial. The lawsuit was filed in federal court under multiple civil rights statutes, seeking compensatory damages for lost wages, punitive damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and injunctive relief requiring Marcus to undergo professional counseling and prohibiting him from supervisory roles over female employees. Marcus's response was predictably aggressive. He hired an expensive legal team that immediately filed motions to dismiss the case, claiming that workplace disputes were a normal part of professional life and that my allegations were vindictive fabrications by a former romantic partner unable to accept the end of their relationship. But the strength of our evidence made his defense untenable. The recordings Jennifer Walsh had made were particularly powerful. Marcus's own voice describing his manipulation tactics contradicted every claim his attorneys made about his innocent intentions. The deposition process was grueling but ultimately cathartic. For 8 hours, Marcus's attorneys tried to discredit my testimony, paint me as an unreliable narrator, and suggest that I'd misinterpreted normal professional feedback as abuse. Mr. Reed was simply trying to help you develop professional skills, his lead attorney argued. His feedback was intended to prepare you for advancement in a competitive industry. By taking credit for my work and presenting it as his own, I replied, by ensuring your good ideas received the attention they deserved from senior management, who might not have taken them seriously coming from a junior employee. Without my knowledge or consent, and without sharing credit. The attorney's inability to provide a satisfactory answer to that question became emblematic of Marcus's entire defense. Every justification he offered for his behavior ultimately relied on the assumption that I was too incompetent to manage my own career, too naive to understand workplace dynamics, and too unstable to interpret his actions accurately. But the evidence told a different story. Email chains showed Marcus systematically taking credit for work he hadn't contributed to. Performance reviews revealed how he'd given me negative evaluations for the same work he'd presented as excellent when claiming credit for it. Financial records demonstrated the career advancement I'd achieved immediately after leaving his influence. The most powerful moment in my deposition came when Marcus's attorney played one of Jennifer's recordings of him describing his manipulation tactics, then asked me to explain how I interpreted his words. He's describing a system for psychologically controlling women in order to exploit their work while preventing their professional advancement, I said. He's not talking about mentorship or guidance. He's explaining how he identifies vulnerable women, breaks down their confidence, and uses their productivity to advance his own career while keeping them dependent on his approval. You're attributing malicious intent to what could simply be poor communication skills. Poor communication skills don't require the level of psychological sophistication Marcus demonstrates in those recordings. He understands exactly what he's doing and why it works. The settlement negotiations began 6 months after we filed the lawsuit. Marcus's insurance company, which was covering his legal costs, began pushing for resolution when it became clear that our case was solid and that a jury trial would likely result in significant punitive damages. They want to settle for $750,000. Jennifer told me during one of our strategy meetings, it's a substantial offer, and it includes the injunctive relief we requested. Marcus would be prohibited from supervisory roles over female employees for 5 years and required to undergo professional counseling. The money was meaningful, but the injunctive relief was more important to me. What about the other women? Can we include provisions that help them too? We can negotiate for Sterling to create a victim compensation fund and to implement additional workplace harassment prevention measures. The settlement can also require Marcus to admit to the specific behaviors he engaged in. The final settlement was even better than our initial offer. $850,000 in total damages, split between compensatory and punitive awards. Sterling agreed to establish a $200,000 fund for other women affected by Marcus's behavior. Marcus was prohibited from any supervisory roles over female employees for 7 years and required to complete 100 hours of professional counseling focused on workplace harassment and abuse. Most importantly, the settlement included a detailed admission of Marcus's specific actions. He was required to acknowledge in writing that he had systematically taken credit for female colleagues' work, deliberately undermined their confidence, and used his supervisory position to manipulate and control their career advancement. This isn't just a financial settlement, Jennifer explained as we reviewed the final documents. It's a legal acknowledgement that what happened to you was real, systematic, and harmful. That admission becomes part of the public record and can be used by other victims in their own cases. The settlement document felt like vindication in a way that even the corporate investigation hadn't achieved. This was a federal court finding that Marcus's behavior constituted legally actionable harm, that his manipulation had caused measurable damage, and that consequences were appropriate. But the most satisfying aspect was the precedent it set. Jennifer told me that our case was already being cited in other workplace harassment lawsuits, providing a roadmap for victims to pursue legal remediation for psychological manipulation and career sabotage. You've established that workplace abuse doesn't have to involve physical contact or overt threats to be legally actionable, she said. The psychological manipulation and professional sabotage you documented are now recognized forms of workplace harassment with real legal consequences. The settlement money allowed me to make choices about my career that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. I was able to reduce my client load at Meridian to focus more on advocacy work, speaking engagements, and pro bono consulting with organizations addressing workplace harassment. But more than the financial security, the legal settlement provided psychological closure. For years, Marcus had made me question whether my perceptions were accurate, whether his treatment of me was really as harmful as it felt. The federal court settlement was official validation that my experiences were real, my pain was justified, and justice was possible. The document sits in my filing cabinet now, 17 pages of legal language that translate to something much simpler. The truth, officially recognized with consequences attached. Sometimes justice is a long time coming, but when it arrives, backed by the full weight of the legal system, it feels like the universe finally acknowledging what you knew all along, that your pain mattered, that your truth was valid, and that no one has the right to diminish you without facing the cost of that choice. This speaking engagement program sits framed on my office wall, a reminder of how far I've traveled from the woman who once believed she was nothing without. Marcus reads validation. Clarice Truman. From Victim to Victor, Breaking the Silence. On Workplace Manipulation reads the header above my photograph, professional and confident in a way that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. Below it, the event details. National Women's Leadership Conference, keynote address, October 15th. It's been 2 years since the reunion, 18 months since the Sterling investigation, and 6 months since the legal settlement. In that time, I've spoken at dozens of conferences, consulted with over 30 companies on workplace harassment policies and helped establish 3 nonprofit organizations focused on supporting victims of professional abuse, but more than the external changes. I've undergone an internal transformation that still amazes me. The woman in that program photo bears little resemblance to the anxious, self-doubting person who used to seek Marcus's approval for every decision. This morning, I'm preparing for my biggest speaking engagement yet, the opening, keynote for a conference that will reach over 2,000 professional women. As I review my presentation notes, I'm struck by how naturally confidence sits on me now. How easily I inhabit my own authority. My phone buzzes with a text from David Chun, not Lisa's brother, but a different David, a man I've been dating for 6 months. Break a leg today, he writes. Though knowing you, you'll probably change some lives instead. David is everything Marcus wasn't supportive without being controlling, interested in my work without trying to claim credit for it, confident in his own achievements without needing to diminish mine. Our relationship is built on mutual respect and genuine partnership, concepts I'd read about but never truly experienced until now. When I told him about my history with Marcus, his response was immediate and unequivocal. I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm grateful you had the strength to fight back. Your courage probably protected other women from going through the same thing. No attempt to minimize my experience, no suggestion that I'd misinterpreted Marcus's behavior, no implication that I bore responsibility for the abuse I'd endured. Just validation, support, and respect for my strength. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and shared values rather than the intense, overwhelming passion that had characterized my relationship with Marcus. I'd learned to see that intensity is a red flag. Healthy love doesn't require constant drama or emotional manipulation to sustain itself. You seem so peaceful now, Sarah had observed during our last coffee date. Not peaceful like you've given up on ambition, but peaceful like you're not fighting yourself anymore. She was right. The constant internal battle between my instincts and Marcus's version of reality, between my desires and his approval, between my worth and his assessment of it, had finally ended. I knew who I was, what I valued, and what I would and wouldn't accept in my relationships. My career at Meridian had flourished in ways that validated everything I believed about my abilities before Marcus convinced me otherwise. Last month, Amanda Chun had promoted me to creative director, a role that came with significant autonomy and the opportunity to mentor other young professionals. Your work with workplace harassment prevention has made you one of the most respected professionals in our industry, Amanda said when she offered me the promotion. But more than that, your leadership style, collaborative, empowering, focused on bringing out the best in others, is exactly what this department needs. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had tried to convince me I wasn't leadership material, that I was too emotional and trusting to manage others effectively. Now I was leading a team of 12 professionals, and my approach based on respect, communication, and genuine investment in others' success was being held up as a model. For the agency, the nonprofit work had become equally rewarding, the foundation for professional integrity, which I'd helped establish with funding from my legal settlement, had already assisted over 200 women in documenting and reporting workplace abuse. We developed training programs, legal resources, and support networks that were making real differences in women's professional lives. You've created something that will outlast any individual case, Dr. Martinez had observed during one of our recent sessions. We still met monthly, though our work had shifted from trauma processing to life planning and continued growth. Sometimes, I can't believe this is my life, I told her. 3 years ago, I was convinced I was worthless without Marcus. Now I'm helping other women understand their worth, and I'm more successful than I ever was when he was guiding my career. What do you think changed? I learned to trust myself again. And I learned that my experiences, even the painful ones, have value if I use them to help others. The speaking engagement today would be my largest audience yet, but I felt none of the anxiety that would have consumed me during my relationship with Marcus. I knew my material, I believed in my message, and I was confident in my ability to deliver it effectively. My presentation focused on 3 key themes: recognizing manipulation tactics in professional settings, documenting abuse in ways that create accountability, and transforming personal trauma into collective power for change. But the underlying message was simpler. You are not crazy. You are not alone. And you have more power than your abuser wants you to believe. As I stood at the podium, looking out at 2,000 women who represented every industry and career level, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The scared, confused woman who'd ended up in the emergency room, convinced she was too weak for professional success. The isolated victim who'd believed her abuser's version of reality over her own instincts. The broken person who thought leaving Marcus meant giving up her future. 2 years ago, I began, my voice clear and strong. I was in an abusive relationship. That had convinced me I was nothing without my abuser's guidance. Today, I'm here to tell you that the opposite was true. I was everything I needed to be, and I always had been. I just needed to remember it. The audience was completely silent, focused, engaged. I could see women throughout the auditorium nodding in recognition, some taking notes, others wiping away tears. The most insidious thing about workplace manipulation is how it makes you complicit in your own diminishment. I continued. Abusers are skilled at making their control feel like support, their theft feel like collaboration, their criticism feel like guidance. They convince you that your success depends on their approval, that your perceptions can't be trusted, that you should be grateful for their attention. I clicked to my next slide, which showed the timeline of my recovery therapy: documentation, legal action, career advancement, advocacy work. But here's what I've learned. Healing from abuse isn't just about recovering what you lost. It's about discovering what you never knew you had. Every skill Marcus tried to convince me I lacked, I actually possessed in abundance. Every weakness he claimed to see in me was actually a strength he was trying to suppress. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, covering the practical aspects of recognizing and responding to workplace abuse, but also the deeper work of rebuilding self-trust and reclaiming personal power. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. But more meaningful were the conversations afterward, women who recognized their own experiences in my story, who felt validated in their perceptions, for the first time in years, who were ready to take action against their own abusers. You've given me permission to trust myself again. One woman told me as I signed her copy of the resource guide our foundation had developed. I've been questioning my sanity for months, wondering if I was overreacting to my supervisor's behavior, but listening to you, I realize I'm not crazy, I'm being manipulated. Another woman approached with tears in her eyes. I wish I heard this presentation 5 years ago. I quit a job I loved because I thought I wasn't good enough, when really I was being sabotaged by someone who felt threatened by my abilities. These conversations reminded me why the work was so important. Marcus hadn't just hurt me, he'd hurt 7 women that we knew about, and probably others we'd never identified. But by speaking out, by refusing to stay silent about abuse, we'd prevented him from harming more women and educated others to recognize and resist manipulation. As I packed up my materials and prepared to leave the conference, I reflected on the strange mathematics of trauma and healing. Marcus had tried to make me smaller, but his abuse had ultimately made me larger, more empathetic, more courageous, more committed to justice. He tried to silence me, but I've found my voice in ways I never would have without the experience of nearly losing it. The speaking engagement program would join dozens of others in my office, tangible evidence of a life rebuilt on my own terms. But the real measure of my transformation wasn't in the awards or recognition or professional success. It was in the quiet confidence. I felt walking through the world as myself, flawed, strong, worthy, and free. It was in the relationship with David, built on respect rather than control. It was in the work I did every day to help other women recognize their worth and find their voices. Marcus had been wrong about everything, but he'd been most wrong about this. I wasn't nothing without him. I was everything I'd always been, finally free to prove it. And that freedom to be myself, to trust myself, to use my voice and my experiences to create change was the most beautiful revenge I could have imagined. Sometimes, the best way to defeat someone who tried to destroy you is simply to thrive. To build a life so meaningful, so purposeful, so authentically your own that their attempt to diminish you becomes irrelevant. I'd not only survived Marcus Reed's attempt to make me nothing, I'd become everything he tried to prevent me from being: powerful, confident, successful, and completely, undeniably myself. The woman he claimed to have made had shown the world exactly who she was without him, and she was magnificent.